Hello, night listener, and welcome to Little Nightmare. I'm Emma, and tonight I'll be keeping you company to help you fall asleep. But before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. Story 1. The Wind Began It. A low susurrus through the drying cornfields that surrounded the town of Hemlock Grove. It was not a gentle wind. It carried the scent of wood smoke and decay, of cold earth, and the waxy, vegetal smell of freshly carved pumpkin guts. It slipped through the silence of a late October afternoon, whispering through the bare branches of the oaks that lined Elm Street, making the skeletons hanging from porch eaves dance a jittery jig. The leaves, crimson and burnt umber, did not simply fall. They were scraped from the limbs by this insistent, probing air, skittering across asphalt with a sound like 1,000 scurrying insects. To anyone who paused to listen, truly listen, the wind seemed to be forming words. A sibilant, ancient language spoken only on the threshold of Halloween. Amos Decker heard it. He stood on his porch, a large, quiet man whose hands were still smeared with the orange pulp of the great pumpkin he had just eviscerated. The jack-o'-lantern sat at his feet, its triangular eyes and jagged grin flickering with the candle S-life. It was only October 28th, but the town was already deep in its annual transformation. Every house on the block was adorned. Synthetic cobwebs clung to hedges, plastic gravestones tilted in front yards, and from every porch, a carved sentinel glowed. It was a pageant of pretend fear, a comfortable shiver before the warm hearth of home. But as Amos watched the wind tear another handful of leaves from the maple across the street, he felt a different kind of chill, one that seeped into the bone, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature. His phone, resting on the porch railing, buzzed. Not a call, not a text. A pulse. The screen flared to life, not with a notification, but with a pattern. A complex, spiraling mandala of black and orange, twisting in on itself. A hypnotic pinwheel that seemed to suck the light from the afternoon. It was there for only a second, then gone. The screen went black. Amos picked it up, thumbed the power button. Nothing. It was a dead slab of glass and metal. He looked down the street. Mrs. Henderson was arranging a bowl of candy on her porch swing. She suddenly straightened up, her hand going to her own phone in her apron pocket. She pulled it out, stared at it, then dropped it as if it had burned her. It shattered on her welcome mat. She didn't seem to notice. She stood there, perfectly still, her head cocked as if listening to a distant sound. Then she turned and went inside, closing the door with a soft, final click. The normalcy of the scene was what unnerved him. There was no scream, no panic, just a quiet, profound wrongness. That was the first day. The day the signal came on the wind. The 29th dawned gray and cold, a thick fog coiling through the streets, mingling with the artificial mist from a dozen fog machines, until the town was submerged in a soupy, spectral brine. The world had become a silent film. Sounds were muffled, the shapes of houses and trees blurred into ominous suggestions. Amos had tried to call his wife, Sarah, and his daughter, Lily, who were visiting Sarah's mother 2 towns over. The landline was dead. His cell was a paperweight. The power had flickered out sometime in the night. He ventured out for supplies. The supermarket was a study in quiet desperation. People moved with a hushed urgency, their carts filled with canned goods and bottled water, their eyes avoiding contact. The festive Halloween music, usually piped through the speakers, was absent, leaving only the squeak of wheels and the rustle of shopping bags. Amos saw a man in the produce section, just standing by the bruised and rotting pumpkins, staring at a blank smartphone screen. He was muttering, a low, rhythmic chant that sounded like trick or treat, over and over. His eyes were wide, unblinking, the pupils dilated into black pools. Amos moved quickly away, the man's vacant stare clinging to him like a cobweb. On his way home, he saw the first of them, a group of 4 or 5 standing in the middle of the town square. They were not talking. They were not moving. They simply stood, facing different directions, like scarecrows placed haphazardly in a field. Their clothes were rumpled, their faces slack. One of them, a woman, still held a leash, but the end was empty, the collar dragging on the damp pavement. As Amos drove slowly past, their heads, in perfect, unnatural unison, swiveled to track his car. Their eyes held the same flat, hungry blackness as the man in the supermarket. They were not people anymore. They were things wearing people suits, their humanity hollowed out and replaced by the silent, spiraling signal. He found his first companion that evening. Her name was Alina, a high school teacher who had barricaded herself in her classroom when the chaos began. She had seen it happen to the principal, a man she'd known for 10 years. He'd been complaining about the Wi-Fi being down when his phone buzzed. He'd looked at it, his face going slack, and then he had attacked the school secretary with a letter opener, his movements jerky and relentless, like a puppet with its strings cut. Alina had escaped through a window. She was pragmatic, fierce, her fear a sharp, useful tool. She called them the Hollows. Their eyes, she whispered to Amos as they huddled in his living room, the only light coming from the guttering jack-o'-lantern on the porch. It's like something looked at them through that little screen, and they forgot how to be people. The 30th was the day the pretending stopped. The Hollows were no longer static. They moved through the fog-shrouded streets in loose packs, their silence more terrifying than any scream. They did not run, they walked with a dreadful, purposeful stride. And they were drawn to sound, to light, to life. Amos and Alina watched from an upstairs window as a group of them surrounded a house down the street where a generator was humming. They did not break the door down. They simply pressed against it, their bodies thudding dully, rhythmically, until the wood splintered. The generator's hum choked and died, and the sounds that followed were not human. The Halloween decorations, once whimsical, had become grotesque. The plastic skeletons strung up in trees now seemed like premonitions. The jack-o'-lanterns, their candles long since extinguished, seemed to watch the street with a knowing, rotten glee. The wind, constant now, played a discordant symphony through the chimes and rattled the fake gravestones. It was as if the holiday itself, the ancient, pagan threshold of Samhain, had decided to make good on all its dark promises. The veil was not just thin, it was in tatters. That night they were joined by a boy. Couldn't he have been more than 12, his face smeared with dirt, a cheap plastic superhero cape tied around his neck? His name was Leo. He had been hiding in his basement, listening to the things that had been his parents shuffle and thud against the door upstairs. They kept ringing the doorbell, he told them, his voice a thin, reedy thing. Over and over, ding-dong, ding-dong, like they were waiting for someone to answer. Amos knew he had to leave. Hemlock Grove was a death trap. Sarah and Lily were in Cedar Brook, 20 miles away. It might as well have been 1,000. But the thought of his daughter, her small face alight with the joy of dressing up, waiting for him on a night that had devoured all joy, was a hook in his heart. He had to try. On the morning of October 31st, Halloween Day, they left. Amos, Alina, and Leo in Amos' old pickup truck, its bed filled with what supplies they could scavenge. The world outside Hemlock Grove was a confirmation of their worst fears. Abandoned cars littered the highway, some with their doors hanging open, as if the occupants had simply evaporated. Fires smoldered in the distance, and everywhere the hollows walked. They moved along the roadsides, through the fields, their heads down, a silent, shambling pilgrimage to some unknown destination. They were not mindless. There was a terrible coordination to their movements, a hive-mind purpose that was far more frightening than random violence. They drove through a landscape painted in the colors of the season. The cornfields were a sea of dried gold, but the mazes within them now seemed impossibly complex, their paths shifting in the corner of the eye, and dark figures stood motionless deep within the rows. Scarecrows, their heads cocked at unnatural angles, seemed to track the truck's progress. The sky was a hard, porcelain blue, the sun a cold, distant coin. The beauty of the day was a mockery. They found others. A handful of survivors holed up in a roadside church. They spoke in hushed tones of a figure they called the Harvest King. A hollow, they said, but different. Taller, wearing the tattered remains of a fine suit, his face obscured by an antique porcelain mask they swore was not a mask at all. He was never seen to move, yet he was always at the forefront of the packs, a silent conductor directing his orchestra of the damned. Where the Harvest King walked, the Halloween decorations seemed to writhe with a life of their own. Pumpkins would split open, not with rot, but with a wet, red flowering. The plastic skeletons would turn their skulls to watch him pass. The group's journey became a nightmare pilgrimage through the heart of a corrupted American autumn. They avoided towns, sticking to back roads, the truck a fragile metal shell in a world reverting to wilderness. The tension was a physical presence in the cab, a cold knot in the stomach that tightened with every mile. Leo rarely spoke, just clutched his cape and stared out the window at the orange and black world gone mad. They reached the outskirts of Cedar Brook as the sun began to bleed away behind the hills, staining the sky the color of a bruised pumpkin. The town was silent, but it was not empty. Jack-o'-lanterns glowed on every porch, their light a malevolent, welcoming beacon. The hollows were here too, but they were different. They were gathered in the streets, not shambling, but standing in rows, as if awaiting a command. And they were all facing the town square. Amos left Alina and Leo hidden in a tool shed behind an auto body shop, the truck concealed in a thicket of dying bushes. "If I am not back by dawn," he told Alina, his voice low and steady, "you go. Head north. Find someplace cold and empty." He moved through the backyards and alleys, a ghost in his own life. The air was thick with the cloying smell of sugar and rot, the scent of 1,000 uneaten candy bars, and the deeper, older decay of the season itself. He could hear a low, rhythmic sound coming from the center of town, a chanting. Not words, but a single, pulsing note, a hum that resonated in his teeth and bones. It was the sound of the signal given voice. The town square was a scene from a pagan ritual resurrected in a suburban nightmare. Hundreds of hollows stood in a perfect circle, their faces upturned, their black eyes reflecting the light of a massive bonfire that raged in the center of the green. And in the fire, burning with a fierce, unnatural intensity, was a mountain of technology. Smartphones, tablets, laptops, televisions, a pyre of the modern world, crackling and spitting plastic and glass. The Harvest King stood before the flames. The porcelain mask was indeed no mask. It was his face, smooth and expressionless, painted with the faint, cruel smile of a vintage Halloween decoration. In one hand, he held an old-fashioned, horn-shaped wicker basket, a trick-or-treat basket. As Amos watched from the shadow of a bank building, the Harvest King raised his other hand. The humming ceased. The silence was absolute, broken only by the roar of the fire. Then, from the basket, he began to scatter something into the crowd. Not candy, small black seeds. They fell among the hollows, who did not scramble for them, but simply stood as they landed at their feet. And Amos saw her. On the other side of the circle, held by 2 hollows, was his daughter, Lily. She was wearing her costume, a fairy princess, the tinsel in her hair glittering in the firelight. Her face was pale, terrified, but her eyes were still her own. She saw him. Her mouth formed the silent word, "Daddy." Reason left him. Amos burst from the shadows, his wife S' name a roar in his throat. He did not feel the hands that grabbed at him, did not see the blank faces that turned his way. He was a force of pure, paternal desperation, plowing through the motionless figures. He reached Lily, shoving the hollows away from her. They fell back without a fight, their grip slack, as if they had only been holding her because they were told to. He swept her into his arms, turning to run, and found his path blocked by the Harvest King. The thing stood before him, the fire blazing behind it, a towering silhouette crowned with flame. It made no move to attack. It simply looked down at him, the painted smile on its porcelain face seeming to deepen. It raised a single, long-fingered hand and pointed, not at Amos, but at the bonfire. The flames surged, and within them Amos saw it. The signal. The same black and orange spiral, now 100 feet high, twisting in the heart of the fire. It was a doorway, and through it he glimpsed things that defied shape and logic, vast and patient and cold, things that had been waiting on the other side of the veil for a night when it was thin enough to look through, to reach through. This was not a technological apocalypse. That had merely been the key. This was a harvest, a reaping, and Halloween was the scythe. The harvest king lowered its hand and made a gentle, shooing motion. A dismissal. Amos did not hesitate. He clutched his daughter to his chest and ran. He ran past the hollows, who parted for him without a sound. He ran through the streets of Cedar Brook, past the glowing, watching jack-o'-lanterns, under the claw-like branches of the oaks. He did not stop until he reached the tool shed. Alina looked at his face and asked no questions. They got in the truck. Amos drove, not north, not to any destination. He just drove, away from the fire, away from the humming, away from the thing wearing the porcelain mask. Lily slept fitfully against his side, her small hand clutching his shirt. As they crested a hill outside of town, he glanced in the rearview mirror. Cedar Brook was a single, glowing point of orange light in the vast darkness, a lone, monstrous jack-o'-lantern left burning on the porch of the world. He knew, with a certainty that settled in him like a stone, that Sarah was gone, consumed by the silence. He knew that the harvest king had let him take Lily. A single seed spared from the sowing, a message, or a promise. He drove on into the deep, cold October night. The road ahead was black and empty. The wind had finally fallen silent. The only sound was the hum of the truck's engine, a feeble human noise against the immense and ancient quiet of the world. He did not look back. There was nothing behind him any more but the dying year, and the things that now walked in its skin, waiting for the next Halloween to come, when the veil would be thin again, and the harvest would continue. He just drove, slowly, steadily, away from the light, and into the waiting dark. The silence in the cab was a heavy, living thing. It was broken only by the whine of the tires on asphalt and the shallow, hitched breathing of his daughter. Lily had not spoken a word since he de-pulled her from that circle. She just stared ahead, her fairy wings bent and cracked, her small body trembling with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. In the rearview mirror, Amos could see Alina's face, pale and grim, her arm around Leo, who had buried his face in her side. He drove without headlights, guided by the faint glow of a 3/4 moon that cast the world in shades of bone and ink. The darkness felt safer. Light was a beacon. Light was an invitation. The road was a serpentine path through a sleeping countryside, but nothing was truly asleep. He could feel the wrongness in the land, a subtle vibration through the steering wheel, a pressure in the air that made his ears pop. The hollows were out there, moving through the fields and forests, a silent, patient tide. After an hour, the truck began to sputter. The fuel gauge had been hovering near empty for miles, a detail lost in the frantic escape. The engine coughed, shuddered, and then died completely, the silence rushing in to fill the void left by its mechanical hum. They rolled to a silent stop on the shoulder, shrouded by the skeletal branches of a large oak. "What is it?" Alina whispered, her voice tight. "Out of gas," Amos said, his own voice a dry rasp. He rested his forehead against the cool steering wheel. The enormity of their situation crashed down upon him. They were stranded, 20 miles from nowhere, in a world that had been systematically dismantled. "We can stay here," Alina said. "We raise sitting ducks." Amos nodded, lifting his head. He looked at Lily, then back at Alina. "There's a farm, about a mile down this road. The Millers, they ray old, keep to themselves. They might have a generator, fuel. It was a risk. Every step was a risk. But staying put was a death sentence. They gathered what they could from the truck, a half-empty bottle of water, a flashlight that was fading fast, a tire iron that Amos gripped like a talisman. He lifted Lily into his arms. She was light, too light, and she clung to his neck without a sound. They walked, a small, desperate procession in the moonlit dark. The only sounds were the crunch of their feet on gravel and the rustle of the wind through the dead corn in the fields beside them. The corn seemed to watch them, the dried stalks clicking together like bony fingers. After a while, Leo, his voice small and muffled, said, "They ray in there. I can hear them walking." Amos heard it too, a dry, shuffling sound, keeping pace with them from within the impenetrable wall of corn. He tightened his grip on the tire iron. "Just keep walking. Don T. Look." The Miller farm appeared like a ghost ship in a sea of gray land. The farmhouse was dark. The barn door yawned open, a black mouth. No lights, no signs of life. But as they drew closer, Amos saw a single, flickering glow from the root cellar doors, set into a small hillock near the house. Someone was down there. He approached cautiously, signaling for Alina and the children to hang back. He knelt by the slanted wooden doors, a sliver of lantern light bleeding out from between the planks. He knocked softly, a series of 3 quick raps. The light inside shifted. A moment later, a weathered, fearful face appeared in the crack. Old Man Miller, his eyes wide with a terror that had aged him a decade in a few days. "Amos," he croaked, "that you?" "It's me, John. We need a place. Just for a little while." Miller's eyes darted past him, scanning the darkness. "They ray everywhere, in the fields. They just stand and watch the house. They don't do nothing, just watch." He unlatched the door and swung it open. "Get in. Quick." The root cellar was cramped and earthy, smelling of potatoes and damp soil. A single kerosene lantern sat on a crate, its flame dancing nervously. Mrs. Miller huddled on a cot, wrapped in a blanket, her eyes vacant. She was holding a small, battery-powered radio, from which issued only a steady, unwavering hiss. Everything S gone, John Miller said, sinking onto an upturned bucket. The TV, the phones, then the radio yesterday. It started playing that sound, like a horn far away. Then just this. He gestured at the static. It's listening. I know it is. Amos set Lily down next to Alina. We saw it, John, in Cedar Brook. There's something directing them. A thing they call the Harvest King. Miller's face went ashen. The writer, he whispered. My grandpappy told stories. Said when the world got too loud, too full of itself, the old things would wake up. A rider on a pale horse, who'd come at the end of harvest to collect what was owed. He said the rider didn't take souls. He just turned them off, made them part of the quiet. He looked at the hissing radio. He said you'd know him by his silent face. A cold knot tightened in Amos's stomach. The porcelain mask, the silent face. Suddenly, the shuffling sound from the field stopped. The silence that followed was deeper, more profound, a vacuum that sucked the air from the cellar. They all froze, listening. Then, a new sound began. A soft, rhythmic thump, thump, thump against the cellar doors. It was the sound of a single, open hand, beating slowly, patiently, on the wood above their heads. It was not the frantic thudding of a mob. This was different, measured, deliberate. Each impact sent a fine shower of dirt sifting down between the cracks of the old doors, dusting their faces and shoulders. Thump, thump, thump. No one moved. No one breathed. Leo had his entire fist pressed against his mouth, his eyes wide and unblinking. Alina had pulled Lily into her chest, shielding her, though she could not shield her from the sound. Old man Miller stared upward, his jaw working soundlessly, his wife's hand clutched in his, her knuckles white. The thumping stopped. The silence was somehow worse. It was a listening silence. Amos could feel a presence on the other side of the wood, a cold weight settling over the cellar. He could picture it standing there, tall and still, its porcelain face tilted, its painted smile fixed on the doors. The Harvest King, the rider. He knew it with a certainty that froze the blood in his veins. Then a new sound, a slow, dry scraping. Something was being dragged across the wood, back and forth, with a patient, awful finality. It was the sound of a nail, or perhaps a single, long finger tracing a line just above their heads. John Miller made a small, choked sound in his throat. His eyes were fixed on the radio. The steady hiss of static had changed. It had softened, coalesced, shaping itself into a faint, distant pattern. A rhythm. It was matching the slow, patient scrape, scrape, scrape from above. The world outside was speaking to them, and the world inside was answering. Amos looked at the tire iron in his hand. It felt absurdly small, a child's toy against the ancient, patient horror that had found them. He looked at Lily's face, pressed against Alina's coat. He saw the utter vacancy in Mrs. Miller's eyes. He saw the defeat in John's. This was how it happened. Not with a bang, but with a slow, scraping insistence that wore you down until you just turned off. The scraping stopped. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, a soft, rustling sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. It faded slowly, moving away from the cellar doors across the yard, and then it was gone. No one spoke for a full minute. The only sound was the radio, which had returned to its featureless, listening hiss. "It has gone," Alina finally whispered, the words cracking in the dry air. "No," Amos said, his voice low and hollow. "It has not gone. It has just done with us for now." He looked at John Miller. "We can stay here. It knows we ray here." John nodded slowly, his shoulders slumping. "Where will you go? Away from the roads, away from the towns." Amos's mind was racing, discarding options. The highways were death. The farms were traps. The woods, the deep woods. "The woods are full of them things," John said. But there was no argument in his tone, only a statement of fact. "I know," Amos said. "But out there, maybe we ray just another animal. Maybe we ray not worth the harvest." He didn't believe it, but it was the only path left. They shared the last of the water. Amos left the Millers with the fading flashlight. There were no goodbyes, only a shared look of profound, terminal understanding. They slipped out of the cellar into the pre-dawn gloom. The air was bitingly cold, and the world was utterly still. The farmyard was empty. There was no sign of the thing that had stood above them, only a single, long, faint scratch in the paint of the cellar door. Amos led them across the barren field behind the house, toward the dark, waiting line of the forest. As they reached the tree line, he glanced back one last time. In the east, the sky was beginning to lighten from black to a deep, bruised gray. The Miller farmhouse stood silent and dark. And there, standing motionless in the center of the back porch, was a figure. It was too far away to see clearly, but Amos knew the set of its shoulders, the shape of its stillness. It was John Miller. He was just standing there, facing the coming dawn, his hands at his sides. He did not wave. He did not move. He was already part of the quiet. Amos turned his back and pushed into the woods, leading his small, ragged family deeper into the shadows, away from the rising light, and into the unknown heart of a world that had been permanently and terribly reaped. The woods were a cathedral of silence. The dense canopy of pine and bare-limbed oak choked the weak dawn light, creating a perpetual twilight. The normal sounds of a forest, in autumn, the scolding of squirrels, the call of birds, the rustle of unseen creatures were absent. It was as if the entire ecosystem had been muted. They walked single file, Amos in the lead with the tire iron, then Lily, her small hand clutching the back of his jacket, then Alina with Leo. They did not speak. Words felt like a blasphemy here. They followed a shallow creek, its water black and slow-moving. It was the only logical path, a way to cover their tracks and find water. Amos's mind replayed the sight of John Miller on the porch, a man already surrendered. He thought of Sarah, her face lost behind a screen, consumed by the signal. He looked down at Lily, who had still not made a sound. Her silence was different from the world. It was a small, warm pocket of trauma, a quiet he could still hope to heal. Around midday, they found the deer. It was a large buck, its antlers a majestic crown tangled in the undergrowth. It was not dead. Its sides heaved with ragged breaths, and its eyes were wide with a terror that was purely, recognizably animal. But it made no sound, and it did not struggle. It simply lay there, waiting. As they drew closer, Amos saw why. Its legs were bent at impossible angles, broken not by a fall or a predator, but as if some immense, casual force had simply twisted them. It was a piece of discarded machinery. Leo let out a small, choked sob and buried his face in Alina's side. Amos forced them to move on, his own stomach churning. The message was clear. The harvest was not just for humanity. It was for everything. The world itself was being broken and silenced. They drank from the creek, the water tasting of iron and decay, and ate a few wild onions Amos dug up with his fingers. It was nothing. Their hunger was a growing, hollow pit. As dusk began to bleed through the trees once more, they found a shallow cave in a rocky outcrop, barely more than an indentation, but it offered some shelter from the wind that had begun to moan through the branches. Amos built a small, concealed fire, using dry twigs that would create little smoke. The flame was a tiny, defiant gesture against the encroaching dark. They huddled around it, the four of them, a tiny island of warmth and fragile life. Lily finally slept, her head in Alina's lap. Leo stared into the flames, his expression old beyond his years. Alina looked at Amos across the fire. Her eyes were red-rimmed with exhaustion, but her gaze was steady. What did it want? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why let us go? Why show you that thing in the fire? Amos poked at the embers with a stick. He saw the vast, twisting spiral in the bonfire, the patient, cold things moving in the spaces between worlds. I think it was a lesson, he said quietly, to show me the scale of it. We weren't escaping. We were being allowed to leave. A single seed, like it said, to carry the knowledge, to know that there's no fighting it, only running. And that, eventually, there will be nowhere left to run. So that's it. Alina's voice was flat. We just wander until we die or become like them. No, Amos said, looking at his daughter. We survive. We find others. If it spared us, it was for a reason. Maybe that reason is just to remember, to be witnesses. But as long as we ray alive, we ray a flaw in its perfect, silent world. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the last thing he had from his old life. A small, smooth stone lily had painted like a ladybug months ago. He held it in his palm, the red and black paint chipped and faded. It was a tiny, stupid, beautiful thing. A human thing. He tucked it back into his pocket as the fire guttered low. The wind outside their small shelter seemed to carry a new sound, a faint, crystalline chiming, like distant wind chimes made of glass and bone. It was a beautiful, haunting sound, and it filled him with more dread than any scream ever could. It was the sound of the world after the harvest, empty and clean, and terribly, terribly elegant. He pulled his family closer, shielding them from the wind and the sound. A solitary man clinging to the noise of his own heartbeat in the vast and listening quiet. The chiming grew no louder, but it seemed to surround them, a lattice of invisible sound woven through the trees. It was directionless, sourceless, a property of the air itself. Leo began to cry, silent, heaving sobs that shook his small frame. Alina rocked him, her own tears cutting clean tracks through the grime on her cheeks. Amos put his arm around them all, drawing them into the circle of his body. A futile human barrier against the aesthetic horror of the new world. When dawn came, it was a muted, gray affair. The chiming had faded with the night, leaving behind the same profound silence. They shared the last of the wild onions, their hunger now a sharp, gnawing pain. The creek water did little to quell it. They continued following the water, their progress slow and stumbling. Lily's silence was beginning to frighten Amos more than the things in the woods. Her eyes were open. She walked when led, but she was a doll, a beautiful, empty shell. He found himself talking to her, just whispering nonsense about the trees, about the ladybug rock in his pocket, about the pancakes he would make her if he ever could again. He was met only with the soft sound of her breathing. It was Leo who saw it first. He stopped, pointing a trembling finger ahead where the creek widened into a small, rocky pool. On the far bank, nestled between the roots of a giant willow tree, was a tent. It was a modern, domed hiker-esque tent, bright blue and glaringly out of place. A single, muddy hiking boot lay on its side by the entrance. Amos raised a hand, signaling a halt. He watched for a long time, the tire iron slick in his grip. There was no movement. The silence here felt different, not the ancient quiet of the harvest, but a newer, more familiar silence. The silence of absence. Cautiously, he waded across the shallow creek, the icy water soaking his pants to the knees. He approached the tent, his senses screaming. He used the tire iron to unzip the flap, half expecting a hollow to come tumbling out. The tent was empty. It was neatly kept, a sleeping bag rolled up, a backpack propped in the corner. A water filtration system, a small camp stove. Treasure. But on top of the sleeping bag, laid out with deliberate care, was a spiral. It was made of smooth, gray river stones, each about the size of a fist. The spiral was perfect, unnervingly so, and in its center lay a single, long feather, black as ink. Amos backed away, his blood running cold. It was a marker, a sign. They were not just wandering, they were being herded. He turned to call out to Alina, to tell her to stay back, but the words died in his throat. On the bank where he had left them, Alina was kneeling, holding Lily. And Lily was staring directly at the tent, her head tilted. Her lips were moving. Amos scrambled back across the creek, his heart hammering against his ribs. He fell to his knees in front of his daughter, Lily, baby, can you hear me? Her eyes, which had been so vacant, were now focused. They were fixed on the perfect, terrible spiral in the tent. Her small voice, rusty from disuse, was a whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "He-s making a song," she said. "He-s making a song with the stones and the trees and the quiet people. And he wants me to sing the last note." He felt the world tilt. The words were not his daughter's. They were too old, too specific, dredged from a place a child should never know. He grabbed her shoulders, perhaps too hard, but he needed to pull her gaze away from the spiral. "No, Lily, you don't have to sing anything. You don't have to do anything." She blinked slowly, her focus shifting from the tent to his face. For a terrifying second, there was no recognition in her eyes, only a calm, alien knowledge. Then, like a veil lifting, it was gone. Her lower lip trembled. "Daddy," she whispered, and the sound was so purely her, so small and scared, that it broke him. He crushed her to his chest, holding her as if he could physically shield her from the thing that had spoken through her. Alina was crying openly now, a mixture of relief and fresh horror. What did she mean, Amos? What last note? He didn't answer. He looked from the spiral in the tent to the path ahead, where the creek bent and disappeared into a thicker part of the forest. This wasn't a wilderness they were lost in. It was a composition. They were notes on a staff, being moved into position. The thought was insane, but it fit the chilling elegance of it all. The Harvest King wasn't just a reaper. He was a conductor of silence, and he had chosen his final instrument. "We're leaving the creek," Amos said, his voice rough. "Now." "But the water," Alina began. "It's leading us. It's all part of the song." He stood, lifting Lily into his arms. She felt insubstantial, a bird. "We go up, to high ground." He pointed to a rocky ridge that loomed through the trees to the north. It looked harsh and exposed, but it was away from the water, away from the path that had been laid out for them. They left the tent and its grim arrangement behind, pushing through thickets that tore at their clothes. The going was brutal without a path. Their hunger was a sharp, constant pain, and their thirst returned with a vengeance. Leo stumbled often, his energy sapped. Amos carried Lily, his own strength fading, driven only by a primal need to break the rhythm, to introduce a dissonance into the Harvest King's symphony. After hours of grueling effort, they reached the base of the ridge. It was steeper than it looked, a jagged spine of granite thrusting from the earth. They started to climb, helping each other over boulders, their breath ragged in the still air. They were halfway up when the chiming began again. It was closer this time, no longer a distant texture, but a clear, distinct sound. It came from the woods below them. Amos, holding onto a rock ledge, looked back. They were emerging from the trees. Dozens of them. The hollows. They moved without haste, their forms gray and indistinct in the fading light. They did not climb. They simply stood at the edge of the tree line, a silent, watching audience arrayed in a perfect semicircle below the ridge. They were waiting for the performance to begin. A cold dread seized Amos, This was the stage. He had led them right to it. Amos, Alina breathed, her hand clutching his arm. He followed her gaze upward, to the summit of the ridge. A figure stood there, silhouetted against the bruised purple sky. It was tall and thin, and even from this distance, Amos could see the smooth, featureless plane of its face reflecting the last of the light. The Harvest King, the rider. It held a long, pale staff that looked as if it had been carved from a single bone. It was not looking at them. It was looking past them, at the gathering of its quiet people, its orchestra of the stilled. Lily stirred in Amos's arms. She lifted her head, her eyes fixed on the figure at the summit. She did not look afraid. She looked attentive. "He's here," she said, her voice clear and carrying in the absolute silence. "The song is almost ready." From the pocket of his coat, Amos felt a sudden, faint vibration. A low, resonant hum. With a trembling hand, he reached in and pulled out the painted ladybug rock. The stone was warm to the touch, and the hum was emanating from it, a single, sustained note that thrummed against his palm. It was a small, defiant noise in the vast, waiting quiet. It was their note, and the conductor on the ridge above them slowly began to turn its head, the featureless face tilted down toward them. It was not a head turning on a neck, but a single, smooth, deliberate reorientation of its entire upper form, like a weather vane finding a new wind. There was no anger in the gesture, no malice. It was the motion of a musician noticing an unexpected, but not entirely unwelcome, sound from the orchestra pit. A new instrument had joined the ensemble. The hum from the painted rock grew stronger, vibrating up Amos's arm, a tiny, desperate heartbeat of resistance. Lily's eyes were locked on the stone, her own small mouth slightly agape, as if she could taste the sound. "It's the memory," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the stone's hum. "It's the noise of the before." The chiming from the forest below swelled in response, a cascade of glassy, discordant notes that sought to smother the rock's simple tone. The hollows remained motionless, but the air around them seemed to thicken, pressing in. The Harvest King took a single step down the ridge toward them. It did not walk so much as glide, its feet seeming not to touch the stone. The long, bone-white staff in its hand began to emit a soft, phosphorescent glow. Alina pulled Leo behind her, her body a shield. "Amos," she said, her voice tight with a terror beyond panic. It was the sound of a final, understanding dread. Amos looked from the advancing figure to the stone in his hand, then to his daughter's face. He saw it then, the connection. Lily was a conduit. The thing on the ridge wanted to use her voice to complete its silent world, to sing the final note that would extinguish all others. But the rock, this stupid, painted piece of their old life, was a key. It was a memory given weight and sound, a fragment of the noisy, messy, human world that had been reaped. The Harvest King was now only 20 feet away, close enough for Amos to see that its smooth face was not a mask, but skin stretched taut and featureless over bone. It raised its staff. The chiming from below rose to a deafening, beautiful crescendo. The pressure in the air became immense, a physical weight pushing them down, trying to force the sound from their lungs, the thought from their minds. Lily gasped, her small body going rigid. Her mouth opened wide, not to scream, but to form a perfect, silent O. Amos didn't he think? He acted. He shoved the humming rock into Lily S. hand and closed her small fingers around it. Hold onto the noise, baby. He yelled over the din. Hold onto the ladybug. Then he turned, putting his body between his family and the Harvest King. The tire iron was a pathetic weight in his hand. He knew it was useless as a weapon, but it was not a weapon. It was a noisemaker. With a final, desperate surge of will, he swung it against the granite ledge he stood on. The clang was shocking. A harsh, ugly, ringing crash of iron on stone. It was a sound of violence and imperfection, a jarring dissonance in the Harvest King's perfect composition. The effect was instantaneous. The beautiful chiming shattered into 1,000 fractured whispers. The hollows below swayed as one, their silent attention broken. The Harvest King halted its advance. The glowing staff dipped slightly. For a single, suspended second, the terrible pressure lifted. In that second, Lily S.'s rigid form relaxed. She looked at the rock in her hand, and then she did something she hadn't done in days. She made a sound of her own. It wasn't a word. It was a whimper. A small, scared, human whimper. The Harvest King's head tilted again. A gesture that now seemed to contain not curiosity, but a cold, final judgment. The dissonance had been interesting, but the piece was flawed. The instrument was broken. It lowered its staff. The light from it faded. The chiming did not return. In the sudden, absolute quiet that followed, the figure simply turned, and in 2 gliding steps, vanished over the crest of the ridge. Amos stood panting, his ears ringing from the clash of metal on stone. He looked down. The hollows were gone. The tree line was just a tree line again, dark and empty. He turned back to his family. Alina was sobbing with relief, clutching a crying Leo. And Lily was looking at him, her eyes full of a clear, recognizable fear. She was back, truly back. It didn't like our song, Daddy. She whispered, clutching the now silent, painted rock to her chest. Amos sank to his knees, the last of his strength gone. He pulled her close. No, honey, he breathed into her hair. It didn't and for the first time that felt like a victory. They were a flaw, they were noise, and they were still alive. The long night was far from over, but they had found their first fragile weapon. They would not go quietly. The silence that remained was different. It was no longer a predatory, waiting thing, but a stunned and wounded quiet. The forest itself seemed to be holding its breath, recovering from the jarring clash of sounds. Amos stayed on his knees, his arms around his daughter, feeling the tremors that ran through her small body. They were the good tremors, the shudders of a soul returning to a vessel it had nearly vacated. Alina crawled over to them, pulling Leo with her, and wrapped them all in a desperate, wordless embrace. They stayed like that for a long time, a tangled heap of warmth and breath and heartbeat on the cold stone. The ordinary, blessed noise of their weeping was the only music in the world. Finally, Amos forced himself to move. "We can't stay here," he said, his voice hoarse. "It's exposed, and it knows where we are." The thought of going back down into the woods, where the hollows had been, was unthinkable. Their only path was up, over the ridge, where the Harvest King had vanished. The idea was a cold stone in his gut, but staying was worse. They climbed. It was a slow, painful process. Their bodies pushed past exhaustion. But a new, grim energy fueled them. They had faced the conductor, and for a moment had made it flinch. They reached the summit as true night fell, the sky a vast, star-dusted black above them. The view from the top made Amos's breath catch. Below, in a wide, sheltered valley, were lights. Not the eerie phosphorescence of the Harvest King, but the warm, flickering yellows and oranges of firelight. Dozens of them. They were scattered, some from windows of what looked like crude cabins, others from larger central fires. It was a settlement. Hope, so long foreign and dangerous, bloomed in his chest. So sharp it was almost a pain. But it was immediately tempered by a cold wave of suspicion. Was this another part of the composition? A beautiful, tragic movement before the final silence. "They have walls," Alina whispered, pointing. A rough palisade of sharpened logs encircled the largest cluster of lights. It was a defensive structure. People who were defending themselves were people who were still fighting. As they watched, a faint, almost imperceptible sound drifted up on the night air. It was the sound of many voices talking, a low, communal murmur. It was the most beautiful sound Amos had ever heard. "Do we go down?" Alina asked, her eyes wide with a mixture of yearning and fear. Amos looked at his children. Leo was asleep on his feet, leaning against his mother. Lily was awake, her eyes fixed on the distant fires, the painted rock still clutched in her hand. "We go down," Amos said, "but carefully we watch first." They found a crevice in the rocks that offered some shelter from the wind and a vantage point over the valley. They had no food, no water, but the sight of the fires below was a sustenance of its own. As they huddled together, Amos kept his eyes on the settlement, searching for any sign of the stillness, any hint of the hollows or their master. He saw movement, figures walking between the fires. They moved with purpose, not the slow, drifting gait of the quiet people. After an hour, he saw a flash of light at the main gate. A torch was being waved in a wide, deliberate arc once, twice, 3 times. Then it repeated the pattern. A signal. A moment later, from a post high on the palisade, another torch repeated the signal back. It was a call and response, a confirmation, a ritual of community. It was noise with meaning. Amos felt the tight knot in his chest loosen just a little. He looked at the stone in Lily's hand. It was just a rock again, cold and inert. But it had served its purpose. It had reminded them of what they were fighting for. Not just to survive, but to be heard. He put his arm around Alina, drawing her close. "In the morning," he said, his voice firm with a new resolve. "We go down in the morning." Below them, the fires of the Defiant burned, tiny points of light in an ocean of silent dark. They were not alone, and as long as one person could still make a noise, the harvest would never be complete. The night was long and cold, but the distant fires held the dark at bay. Amos did not sleep. He watched the settlement, tracing the patterns of the sentries, the rhythmic signaling of the torches. It was a language, one he had almost forgotten. A language of connection. Each flicker was a word shouted into the silence. A promise that someone was still there, still watching. Just before dawn, the main gate opened, and a small group emerged, armed with axes and a single, long-barreled hunting rifle. They moved with a practiced, wary efficiency, scanning the tree line as they began to gather firewood from a stacked pile. They were not reckless, but they were not hiding. They were living. "That's it," Amos murmured, more to himself than to Alina. "We go now," while they're out in the open. Rousing the children was a gentle agony. Leo whimpered with the cold and the deep ache of hunger. Lily was quiet, but her eyes were clear, tracking the movements of the people below. She had not spoken since her whispered words on the ridge, but the vacancy was gone. She was present, huddled deep inside her own small self. They picked their way down the steep slope, their progress slow and noisy in the crisp morning air. Halfway down, one of the wood-gatherers below froze, head snapping up. He shielded his eyes against the rising sun, peering directly at them. He raised a hand, and the others stopped, their axes lowering, the rifle coming up to a cautious, ready position. Amos stopped, holding his own hands out, open and empty. The tire iron was tucked into his belt, a decision he now questioned. He took a deep breath, and then he did the bravest thing he had done since swinging that iron against the rock. He called out. "Hello." His voice was a ragged croak, but it carried in the still air. "We need help." For a long moment, there was no response. The group below stood like statues, assessing. Then, the man who had first seen them gestured. The one with the rifle kept it trained on Amos, while the others retreated quickly inside the gate. The man then stood his ground, waiting alone. It was a painfully long walk to the valley floor. Every step felt exposed. As they drew closer, Amos could see the man's face. He was older, perhaps in his 60s, with a short, grizzled beard and eyes that held no fear, only a deep, weary calculation. His gaze swept over them, taking in their tattered clothes, their hollow cheeks, the way Leo leaned heavily on Alina, the protective way Amos held Lily's hand. "You're from the outside," the man stated. His voice was gravelly, but firm. "Yes," Amos said. "We've been walking for, we don't know how long." The harvest? The man asked, his eyes lingering on Lily. Amos just nodded, the word too heavy to speak. The man's stern expression softened by a fraction. He lowered his hand, and the rifleman on the wall finally lowered his weapon. "Name's Jeremiah," he said. "You picked a hell of a time for a walk in the woods. Come on inside. We'll get you some broth." As they passed through the heavy timber gate, Amos felt a shift in the world. The air within the palisade was different. It smelled of wood smoke and cooked food and unwashed humanity. It was loud. Children's voices echoed from between the cabins. A dog barked. Someone was hammering metal. It was a glorious, chaotic symphony. People stopped to stare as Jeremiah led them through the muddy central lane. Their faces were thin, their clothes patched, but their eyes were alert. They were alive, truly alive. Jeremiah took them to a long, low building where a large iron pot simmered over a central fire pit. A woman with kind eyes and a severe gray braid ladled a thin, steaming broth into wooden bowls and handed them to the children first. Leo drank his in desperate, noisy gulps. Lily held her bowl with both hands, staring into the steam as if it were a miracle. As they ate, Amos told their story. He spoke of the highway, the silence, the hollows, the creek, the tent with the spiral. He spoke of the ridge and the harvest king and the sound of the tire iron. When he mentioned the painted rock, the woman with the braid, who was introduced as Maeve, looked sharply at Lily. The child spoke for it. Maeve asked, her voice low. Amos nodded. She said it was the noise of the before. Jeremiah and Maeve exchanged a long, significant look. "We call them anchors," Jeremiah said finally. "Objects with a strong emotional memory, a connection to the world that was. They can disrupt the stillness for a little while." He stood and walked to a locked chest in the corner of the hall. He produced a key and opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of cloth, were a dozen or so ordinary items. A tarnished silver locket, a cracked pair of eyeglasses, a small, worn teddy bear missing an eye, a baseball. "These are our anchors," Jeremiah said. "They're our early warning system. When the stillness is near, they hum. Sometimes they can push back the quiet people, create a small pocket of safety. But they are finite. Their power fades with use." He looked at the painted rock in Lily's lap. "Yours is still strong. You were lucky." "It wasn't luck," Amos said, looking at his daughter. "It was a memory." Maeve nodded. "The king seeks to replace all memory with his silent song. He harvests the noise from the world and from people. What you call hollows, they are what remains when a person's song is taken. Their memories, their voices, all reaped. The king is building something out of that silence, something final. And the markers, the spirals," Alina asked, her voice trembling. "Signposts," Jeremiah said grimly. "He's charting his territory, preparing the ground. We think the final note your daughter spoke of, it's the note that completes his composition, the note that will allow the silence to become permanent, absolute. A heavy quiet fell over their small group, broken only by the crackle of the fire. They had found sanctuary, but it was a sanctuary under siege. They had found answers, and the answers were more terrifying than the questions. Amos looked around the hall at the faces of the survivors, at his family finally warming by the fire. They had reached a haven, but the war was not over. It was just beginning, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his daughter was not just a potential victim in this war. She was, somehow, a key piece in its outcome. The conductor had chosen his final instrument, and Amos would do anything, make any noise, to ensure that note was never sung. Story 2. The knife went in. The pulp came out. The knife went in. The pulp came out. Jennifer S. Hand moved with a steady, metronomic rhythm that had long since lost its meaning. Scoop, scrape, the wet, stringy sound of pumpkin guts hitting yesterday's newspaper spread across her kitchen island. The orange flesh was cool and slick against her fingers. Each time her hand emerged from the hole carved in the pumpkin-esque crown, it was filled with a tangle of seeds and stringy, clinging fibers. She dropped the handful onto the growing pile. The pile was large, too large for a single pumpkin. The mound of orange and yellow viscera glistened under the pendant light, a small, damp hill of autumn. She had been doing this for some time. How long, she could not say. The afternoon light outside the bay window had been the color of weak tea when she started, a pale gold filtering through the skeletal branches of the old oak in the yard. Now, the light was gone, replaced by a deep, bruised twilight. The clock on the microwave had blinked 5:03 for what felt like an hour. She looked at it again. 5:03. She looked back at the pumpkin. It was not the first pumpkin. There were others, lined up on the counter, their faces already carved into leering grins and triangular eyes, their hollowed-out skulls waiting for the promise of a candle's flame. She could not remember carving them. The knife went in. The pulp came out. This was the ritual. This was the week before Halloween in the quiet, tree-lined suburb of Hemlock Grove. The air itself tasted of October. It was a specific flavor, a blend of wood smoke from a neighbor's fireplace, the sweet, cloying decay of leaves mulching in the rain gutters, and the distant, sugary ghost of a baking apple pie. The wind, when it came, was a cold blade that slid between the buttons of your coat and whispered of the winter waiting in the wings. It rustled the great carpets of crimson and burnt orange leaves that blanketed the lawns. A dry, papery sound like the turning of a million brittle pages. Jennifer finally stopped, her wrist aching. She looked at her hand, coated in a sticky, drying film. She looked at the pumpkin she was working on. It was a massive thing, a prize from the patch, its skin a deep, vibrant orange. She had not yet carved its face. She set the knife down. The silence in the house was a physical presence, thick and heavy. It was a new house, a fresh start she had bought after the divorce, a charming colonial at the end of a cul-de-sac named Raven S. Perch. It was supposed to be peaceful. From outside, carried on the wind, came the sound of children laughing It was a high, sharp sound, the kind of laughter that could easily curdle into a shriek. Trick-or-treaters were tea out in force yet, not for another few days, but the more eager ones, the younger ones, were already practicing, already feeling the ancient thrill of the approaching night. Their costumes would be store-bought superheroes and princesses, but in the deepening twilight, their small forms became silhouettes of something older, something that understood that on this night, you could become something else. Her phone buzzed on the counter, shattering the stillness. It was a text from Mark. "We ray an hour out. You sure about this place? GPS is giving up the ghost." She typed back, her fingers clumsy. It's the dead end. Literally, house at the very back. ULL see the pumpkins. The weekend getaway had been Mark's idea. A chance to christen the new house, to forget the past year, to lean into the spooky season with a group of old friends. A remote getaway, he decalled it, though they were only 40 minutes from the city. Out here, with the woods pressing in on 3 sides and the early darkness, it felt remote enough. Jennifer wiped her hands on a towel and walked to the front window. Her porch was a gallery of grinning jack-o'-lanterns. She counted them. 7. She had only bought 6. The 7th was smaller, lopsided, with a carved smile that was less jovial and more of a grimace, a rictus of pain. Its eyes were slits. She didn't remember making it. She peered closer. The candle inside it guttered, and for a moment, the shadow it cast on the white clapboard wall behind it did not look like a pumpkin-esque shadow at all. It was tall, thin, with elongated limbs. She blinked, and it was just a pumpkin again. The wind picked up, moaning a low note under the eaves. It was then she noticed the corn. The farmer's field behind her property, usually just a brown stubble after the harvest, was now a towering, rustling wall of dried stalks. A corn maze. She hadn't known he was planting one for the season. It stood there, a vast, whispering puzzle of gold and brown, running right up to the edge of her backyard. The entrance was a dark mouth, a gaping void framed by 2 weathered posts. The sound it made was a constant, dry chatter, like a million insect legs rubbing together. It seemed to watch the house. An hour later, headlights swept across the living room wall as Mark's SUV crunched to a halt in the gravel driveway. The arrival of her friends was a burst of noise and cold air, a welcome invasion of the house's creeping silence. There was Mark, big and boisterous, already holding a case of craft beer. Chloe, sharp and artistic, her eyes taking in the high ceilings and crown molding with a professional appreciation. Liam, quiet and thoughtful, and his girlfriend, Sarah, who was already pulling a bottle of wine from her bag. "Jen, this place is amazing," Mark boomed, pulling her into a hug that smelled of cold and cologne. Seriously, middle of nowhere. You could scream and no one would hear you. That's the idea, Jennifer said, forcing a smile. The house came alive with their presence. Music was put on, a low indie folk that suited the autumn mood. The fireplace was lit, the flames dancing and casting long, wavering shadows that played across the faces of the jack-o'-lanterns on the mantel. For a while, the peculiar stillness of the house was banished. They ordered pizza, opened bottles, and the conversation was easy, a river of shared memories and comfortable jokes. But the house and the land around it was not done with its whispers. It was Sarah who first mentioned it. She was standing by the back window, looking out at the corn maze. The harvest moon, a monstrous orange globe, had risen above the black line of the woods, bathing the field in an unearthly, coppery light. "That maze is intense," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "It looks like it goes on forever. And the way it sounds. It's just corn, Sarah," Liam said, coming up behind her and putting his hands on her shoulders. "Is it?" she replied, not turning around. "I swear, a minute ago, I saw something move in there. Not like the wind, something walking." They all looked. The maze was a sea of shifting shadows under the orange moon. The rustling was constant, a hypnotic, dry sibilance. For a moment, they all saw it, a taller patch of stalks swaying against the prevailing wind, moving with a purpose that was not natural. A ripple of motion deep within the golden labyrinth. "Probably just a deer," Mark said, but his voice lacked its usual conviction. He took a long swallow of beer. Later, as the night deepened and the wine bottle emptied, Chloe brought out a Ouija board. "Come on," she said, her eyes glittering in the firelight. "It's almost Halloween. The veil is thin. What's the harm?" They sat on the floor around the coffee table, their fingers lightly resting on the plastic planchette. The fire crackled. One of the pumpkins on the mantel seemed to be watching them, its candle flame flaring for a second. "Is there anyone there?" Chloe asked, her voice a theatrical whisper. The planchette remained still. The wind outside sighed. "This is stupid," Mark grumbled. Then a tremor. It was slight, almost imperceptible. The pointer began to move, slowly at first, then with more certainty. It slid to the letter H, then ARVEST. Harvest, Liam read, frowning. The planchette did not stop. It spelled it out again, faster this time. HARVEST. Then it shot to the word goodbye at the bottom of the board and went still. A collective shiver went through the group. They pulled their hands away. Someone was pushing it, Sarah said, her face pale. "I wasn't tea," Chloe insisted. "It's a game," Jennifer said, standing up. Her knees ached. "A stupid game. Let us call it a night." They went to bed unsettled. The house settled back into its silence, a silence that now felt watchful. Jennifer lay in her bed, in the master bedroom at the back of the house, and listened. She heard the wind. She heard the relentless rustle of the corn. And beneath that, she thought she heard another sound, a low, rhythmic crunching, like something moving slowly, carefully, through the dry stalks. The next day was overcast, the sky a sheet of gray wool. The festive atmosphere of the previous night had evaporated, replaced by a hungover tension. The corn maze stood in the backyard, a silent, brooding challenge. The pumpkins on the porch seemed to have aged overnight. The one with the grimace had begun to collapse in on itself, a black spot of rot spreading from its jagged mouth. It was Mark who suggested they go into the maze. "Come on," he said, slapping Liam on the back. "Shake off the spooks. It's just a tourist attraction. We'll be in and out in 20 minutes. Jennifer, didn't he want to go?" The maze felt wrong, but the pressure of the group, the need to appear normal, to not be the one who was still spooked by a board game, was strong. They put on jackets and stepped out into the biting cold. The entrance to the maze was like stepping into another world. The sound of the wind was immediately muffled, replaced by the intense, close rustle of the corn. The stalks towered over them, 8 feet high, their dry leaves like blades. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk abreast. The ground was soft earth, and their footsteps were swallowed by the whispering of the corn. The air was thick with the smell of dust and dry vegetation, a sweet, deathly smell. They took turns leading, choosing left or right at the intersections. The paths all looked the same. Gold walls, brown earth, gray sky above. The world beyond the maze ceased to exist. There was only the labyrinth, its endless, repeating corridors, and the sound of their own breathing. After what felt like an hour, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a scarecrow. It was not the cheerful, straw-stuffed kind. This one was tall and gaunt, dressed in a tattered black coat that flapped in the breeze. Its head was a burlap sack, and on it was drawn a face not with a smile, but with a wide, horrified O of a mouth, and 2 crude, black XS for eyes. In its hand, it held a real, rusted scythe. The thing was lashed to a rough-hewn cross, its arms outstretched, as if in some perpetual, silent scream. "Okay, that's seriously creepy," Chloe said, pulling out her phone. "No service. Let us just find the way out," Sarah said, her voice tight with anxiety. But the paths they took from the clearing only led them back to the scarecrow. Left, right, it didn't matter. They would walk for 10 minutes, the maze twisting and turning, and then they would find themselves back in the clearing. The scarecrow's stitched eyes seeming to follow them. "We were going in circles," Liam stated, a note of panic edging into his calm demeanor. The light was beginning to fade, the gray sky deepening to slate. The temperature dropped sharply, and then they heard it. Not the wind, not the corn. It was a sound from deeper within the maze, a low, guttural chanting. It was rhythmic, ancient, a single phrase repeated over and over in a language none of them recognized. It was accompanied by a slow, dragging sound. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her hand clutching Liam's arm. Mark stepped forward, his bravado gone, replaced by a primal wariness. "Hello," he called out. His voice was small, absorbed by the corn. The chanting stopped. The dragging sound stopped. The silence that followed was absolute and terrifying. Then, from a path to their left, a figure emerged. It was a man, but only vaguely. He was tall and painfully thin, his body wrapped in rags and dried mud. His skin was pale and cracked, like old parchment. His hair was long and matted with leaves, but it was his face that froze the blood in their veins. He wore no mask, but his features were stretched into a wide, unnatural grin. His lips pulled back from yellow teeth in a rictus that was anything but happy. In his hand, he held a crude knife, fashioned from a piece of flint. He did not move toward them. He simply stood at the mouth of the path, blocking it, his head cocked as if listening. From another path, another figure appeared. A woman, similarly dressed in filth, her body moving with a twitching, insect-like grace. She too wore that same fixed, horrible grin. Then another, and another. They emerged from the corn itself, slipping between the stalks as if they were part of them. They were silent now, but their eyes, deep-set and dark, held a flat, predatory hunger. They were not wearing costumes. This was what they were. The harvest, Liam breathed, remembering the Ouija board. It wasn't a word. It was a name. The feral clan began to advance, their movements slow and deliberate, herding them like animals. Their grins were unwavering. "Run," Mark screamed. The world dissolved into a nightmare of twisting paths and rustling gold. They ran blindly, the group splintering in their terror. Jennifer heard a scream from behind her Chloe S. voice, cut short by a wet, choking sound. She didn't look back. She ran, her heart hammering against her ribs, the cold air burning her lungs. She could hear the things behind her, not running, but loping, their breathing a low, eager panting. They were playing with their food. She burst out of the maze, stumbling into her own backyard. The sky was now a deep, twilight purple. She scrambled for the back door, her hands shaking so badly she could barely turn the knob. She fell inside, slammed the door shut, and threw the deadbolt. She was alone. She had lost the others. She called 911. The dispatcher's voice was calm, maddeningly calm. "Units are responding, Ma AM. Stay on the line. Stay inside." She peered out the kitchen window, the phone pressed to her ear. The corn maze was still. Then she saw them. Mark was being dragged by two of the grinning people, his body limp. Liam was fighting, lashing out, until one of the women swung a heavy, stone-weighted club, and he went down silently. They were being pulled back into the corn, swallowed by the whispering gold. The back door handle jiggled. Then came a knock. It was not a frantic banging, but a slow, polite tap-tap-tap. Then another. It was coming from the front door now. Then the side door. They were surrounding the house. Tap-tap-tap. A relentless, patient rhythm. She hid in a closet under the stairs, curled into a ball among the winter coats that smelled of mothballs and her ex-husband's cologne. She could hear them inside the house now. The soft scuff of bare feet on her hardwood floors. The low, guttural murmurs. They were not ransacking the place. They were exploring, lingering. She heard the wet, squelching sound of someone scooping out the inside of one of her pumpkins. She heard a low, appreciative grunt. She stayed there for hours, until the tapping and the footsteps faded away. The house was silent again. The only sound was the wind, and beneath it, the faint, receding rustle of the corn. It was Deputy Devin Miller who found her. He found her at dawn, still in the closet, shivering uncontrollably. He was young, his face grim as he surveyed the scene. The house was untouched, pristine. There was no sign of a struggle, no blood. The front door was unlocked. The only thing out of place was the pile of pumpkin guts on the kitchen island, which had begun to smell faintly of fermentation and rot. He took her statement as the sun rose, a cold, pale light that did nothing to warm the world. She told him everything, her story a fractured, frantic jumble of grinning people and a sentient corn maze. He wrote it down, his expression neutral, but his eyes held a flicker of pity. He had grown up in this county. He knew the old stories about the land out by Raven S. Perch, stories the new developments had tried to pave over, stories about the things that lived in the woods, the old families who never left, who practiced a different kind of harvest. A search party was organized. They found nothing in the maze but trampled paths and the clearing with the scarecrow. The scarecrow was gone, only the cross remaining. Of Mark, Chloe, Liam, and Sarah, there was no trace. It was as if the corn had simply eaten them. Days turned into a week. The investigation wound down. Halloween came and went. A quiet, somber affair in Hemlock Grove that year. Jennifer moved out, the house on Raven S. Perch standing empty, a for sale sign staked into the perfect lawn. Weeks later, Deputy Miller was driving a country road on the edge of the township, the November fields bare and brown. He saw a flicker of movement and slowed his cruiser. Down in a fallow field, far from the road, he saw a group of people. They were gathered around a small, smoky fire. Even from this distance, he could see their ragged clothes, their gaunt frames. And as one of them turned, he saw the pale flash of a face, the mouth stretched into a wide, unmistakable grin. They were roasting something on a spit over the fire. It was large and vaguely, terribly, shaped like a human torso. He reached for his radio, then stopped. His hand fell away. He looked at the empty fields, the gray sky, the long, lonely road ahead. He thought of Jennifer S. haunted eyes, of the official report that listed her friends as missing, presumed dead, of the easy, comfortable explanations. He thought of the old stories. He put the cruiser in drive and pulled slowly back onto the road. He did not look in the rearview mirror. He drove on, the tires humming a low, steady rhythm on the asphalt. The gray afternoon deepened around him, seamless and silent. The harvest was over. The land was at rest. And the cold settled in for good the following spring. The house on Raven S. Perch was bought by a young couple from the city. They were thrilled by the privacy, the charm of the old place, the potential of the large backyard. The real estate agent had assured them the previous owner's unfortunate incident was just that, an isolated tragedy, a group of friends lost in the woods. A terrible coincidence. Deputy Miller saw the sold sign go up. He felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach, but he said nothing. What could he say? He had no evidence, only a feeling, a memory of a grinning face in a fallow field. He drove past the property sometimes on his patrols and watched as the new owners painted the shutters a cheerful blue. They cleared the old vegetable garden and planted flowers. One evening in late September, he saw the man, Eric, out mowing the lawn. Miller pulled over, the urge to say something, anything, a physical pressure in his chest. Eric waved, friendly and oblivious. "Nice place you've got here," Miller said, leaning out the window. "We love it," Eric replied, shutting off the mower. Quiet, just what we needed. Miller's eyes drifted past him, to the back of the property. The farmer, an old man named Higgins who kept to himself, had plowed the field again. But he hadn't planted soybeans or wheat. The first green shoots of corn were just beginning to pierce the dark soil, stretching in neat, endless rows toward the tree line. The corn miller began, his voice tighter than he intended. "Oh yeah," Eric said, following his gaze. Higgins said he's trying something new. A pick-your-own patch and a maze for the season. Should be fun. Brings in a bit of life. Miller just nodded. He couldn't find the words. He drove away, the image of those green shoots seared into his mind. He knew then that it was a cycle. The land demanded its due. The harvest was not over. It was only just beginning again. That night, he dreamed of tall, rustling stalks and a sound like a million dry whispers, all saying the same word over and over. A name. The first weekend of October, the maize was ready. Higgins had done a frighteningly good job. It was intricate, dense, and from the back porch of the house on Raven's Perch, it looked like a fortress of green and gold. Eric and his wife, Anna, had a party. It was a smaller affair, just a few colleagues from the city. The air was crisp. The pumpkins were carved with friendly faces, and the fire pit crackled merrily. Anna, holding a cup of cider, looked out at the maze. The wind was picking up, making the stalks sway and rustle. "It's so loud," she said, a slight frown on her face. "It sounds like it's talking." Eric laughed and put an arm around her. "It's just corn, honey. It's what it does." Later, as the stars pricked the deep velvet of the sky, one of their guests, a man named Ben, pulled out a small wooden planchette from his jacket. "Found it in an antique shop," he said with a grin. "Anyone feel like asking the spirits a few questions?" Anna shook her head, a sudden, sharp memory of the real estate agent's vague words about the previous owner flashing in her mind. "Not tonight," she said, a little too quickly. "Let us just enjoy the fire." But the others were already gathering around the picnic table, their faces lit by the flickering flames. They placed their fingers on the planchette, giggling. "Is anyone there?" Ben asked, his voice full of mock solemnity. The planchette did not move for a long time. Then, with a sudden, sharp jerk, it shot to the letter H, then ARVEST, One of the women, tipsy on wine, giggled. Harvest. Well, that's appropriate. The planchette did not stop. It spelled it out again, faster this time, the wood scraping against the board. HARVEST. Then it spun in a frantic circle before flying off the board and onto the grass. A small, uncomfortable silence fell over the group. The only sound was the relentless, whispering rustle of the corn. Inside the house, the phone rang. Eric went to answer it. Anna watched him through the window. She saw his easy smile fade, replaced by a look of confusion, then concern. He hung up and came back out, his brow furrowed. "Who was that?" Anna asked. "Wrong number," Eric said, shaking his head. "Some guy. He just said get out of the house," and then hung up. The party's mood was broken. The guests left soon after, their goodbyes subdued. Eric and Anna cleaned up in silence. As Anna was wiping down the kitchen counter, she found a small, dirty handprint on the window frame above the sink. It was small, like a child's, but the fingers were too long, the palm too narrow. It was smeared with what looked like dried mud. She showed it to Eric. "One of the kids from the party must have done it," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. He looked out the window, into the impenetrable darkness of the corn. The rustling seemed to have grown louder, more insistent, a dry, chattering chorus that filled the entire night. He locked the deadbolt on the back door, something they never usually did. The sound was a solid, final thud in the quiet house, but as he turned away, he heard it. A soft, slow tap, tap, tap on the other side of the wood. It was not the wind. It was a rhythm, an invitation, or a warning. Anna looked at him, her eyes wide. The tapping continued, patient and relentless, a sound that was now woven into the fabric of the house itself, as familiar and as dreadful as the whisper of the corn. Eric didn't answer. He stood frozen by the door, his hand still on the deadbolt. The tapping stopped. For a full minute, there was only the sound of their own held breath and the ceaseless rustle from the field. Then it started again, this time from the side window. Tap, tap, tap. It was closer now, more personal. "I'm calling the police," Anna whispered, her voice thin and reedy. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers clumsy, with a fear she didn't understand. The screen glowed to life. No service. The icon in the corner was empty. A cold certainty settled over her. It had been fine an hour ago. "We'll use the landline," Eric said, moving toward the kitchen. He picked up the old corded phone from its cradle. There was no dial tone, only a soft, staticky hiss that, if he listened too closely, almost sounded like whispering. The tapping moved again, circling the house. It was on the front door now, a little louder, a little more impatient. Then it was joined by another from the living room window. Then another from their bedroom window upstairs. A syncopated, surround sound rhythm of gentle knocks. "They're just kids," Eric said, but the words were hollow. "Trying to scare us after the Ouija board thing. Kids don't move that fast," Anna breathed. She was staring out the kitchen window into the blackness. And they don't have faces like that. Eric followed her gaze. For a split second, framed in the window, was a pale oval. The features were indistinct in the dark, but the mouth was a wide, dark gash, a rigid curve that held no mirth. Then it was gone. A new sound joined the tapping. A soft, scraping drag, like something heavy being pulled slowly through the dry soil of the flower beds. It was the sound Jennifer had described in her statement, the one Deputy Miller had filed away and tried to forget. Eric's bravado finally shattered. The car. We can get to the car. He grabbed a heavy flashlight from a drawer and made for the front door. When I open it, we run. Don't look back. Anna clutched his arm, her nails digging into his skin. He took a deep breath, turned the deadbolt, and yanked the door open. The porch was empty. The cool night air washed over them, carrying the thick, sweet smell of decaying vegetation from the maze. The driveway stretched before them, a pale ribbon leading to the dark shape of their SUV. It seemed a mile away. They ran. Their footsteps on the gravel were explosively loud. Halfway there, Anna stumbled, her ankle twisting on a loose stone. She cried out, and Eric stopped to haul her up. As he did, he looked back. The figures were emerging from the edge of the corn, not running, but walking with a slow, deliberate pace. They were silhouettes against the faintly glowing stalks, tall and thin, their movements unnaturally fluid. He couldn't see their faces, but he could see the dark, open shapes of their mouths. Go, 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 he yelled, pushing Anna toward the passenger door. He fumbled for the keys in his pocket, his hands shaking so violently he dropped them on the gravel. He scrabbled for them, his heart hammering in his throat. The figures were closer now, almost at the edge of the lawn. He could hear their breathing, a low, collective rasp. He found the keys, jammed the fob, and heard the beautiful, solid chunk of the doors unlocking. They threw themselves inside, slamming the doors shut. Eric stabbed the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine cranked once, twice, and died. No, he whispered. No, no, no. He tried again. The starter motor whined, sluggish and weak. The interior light flickered. The things were at the hood of the car now. One of them, a woman with long, tangled hair, placed a pale, dirty hand on the windshield. She leaned forward, and her face came into the glow of the dashboard lights. Her grin was a terrifying, fixed thing, her eyes dark and empty. She tapped on the glass with one long fingernail. Tap, tap, tap. The engine caught with a sudden, roaring start. Eric didn't think. He slammed the gear shift into reverse and stomped on the accelerator. The tires spun, spitting gravel, and the car shot backward. He felt a soft, heavy thump against the rear bumper. He didn't stop. He wrenched the wheel, skidded into a 3-point turn, and sped down the driveway. In the rearview mirror, he saw them standing in a group, watching them go. They made no move to follow. They simply stood, their forms receding into the darkness, as if they knew it didn't matter. The car raced down the country road toward the distant, safe glow of the town. But the sound followed them, not outside the car, but inside their heads, the dry, whispering rustle of the corn, and beneath it, the faint, patient rhythm of a tap-tap-tap. Anna was sobbing, a low, broken sound in the dark cabin. Eric drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his eyes darting from the road to the mirror, expecting at any moment to see gaunt figures loping after them. But the road remained empty. They didn't stop until they reached the 24-hour gas station on the edge of town. The fluorescent lights were a shocking, welcome assault. Eric parked directly under a buzzing lamp, and they sat for a long time, just breathing, the normalcy of the place feeling like a fragile dream. "We need to call the police," Anna said, her voice steadier now. Eric just nodded. He used the payphone outside the station, the plastic receiver cold in his hand. He asked for Deputy Miller. When Miller arrived, his face was grim. He listened to their story in the stark light of the station's mini-mart, surrounded by racks of chips and sugary drinks. He didn't interrupt. He didn't look skeptical. When they described the grinning woman at the car window, a muscle in his jaw twitched. He drove them back to the station house to give formal statements. The sun was beginning to rise by the time they finished, staining the sky a sickly gray. Miller offered them coffee from a stale-tasting pot. "I know you probably think we're crazy," Eric said, exhaustion flattening his voice. Miller looked down at his own hands. "No," he said quietly, "I don't." He drove them to a motel on the other side of town, far from Raven's Perch. "Stay here," he instructed. "Don't go back. Not for anything." 2 days later, Eric went back anyway. In the clear light of a Tuesday afternoon, the house looked peaceful. The corn maze from the road was just a field of tall plants. His SUV was still in the driveway. He needed his laptop, his files. He told himself it was just a quick trip. He used the key, the lock turning with a normal, solid click. The house was silent. Everything was in its place. The only sign of the other night was the single, dirty handprint Anna had found, still on the window frame. He grabbed a duffel bag from the closet and began stuffing it with clothes and his important documents from the home office. As he passed the kitchen, he saw it. On the island, where the pile of pumpkin guts had been for Jennifer, was a new offering. A small, neatly arranged pile of ripe, yellow corn kernels. And in the center of the pile, resting on the cold granite, was the small wooden planchette from the Ouija board. It was pointing directly at the back door, toward the maze. He dropped the duffel bag and ran. He didn't look back. He sped away from Raven's Perch for the last time. The image of those kernels burned into his mind. They weren't a threat. They were an invitation, a promise of a bounty to come. He told Anna about the corn, but not the planchette. Some things were better left unsaid. They hired movers to empty the house, a team of large, unsmiling men who worked quickly and asked no questions. The FOR sale sign went back up. Deputy Miller saw it a week later. He made his usual patrol, slowing as he passed the property. The house was empty again, the cheerful blue shutters already looking forlorn. His eyes were drawn, as always, to the back field. The corn was high and golden, ready for the picking. And standing at the edge of the maze, just where the green stalks met the lawn, was a single, ragged figure. It was Old Man Higgins. He wasn't moving. He was just staring toward the road, toward Miller's cruiser. And even from this distance, Miller could see the pale, fixed curve of his smile. It was not a greeting. It was a statement. The land had been fed. It was patient. It would wait for the next season, and the next family, and the harvest after that. Miller drove on, the weight of the secret settling deep into his bones, as permanent and as cold as the coming winter. The movers had taken everything, leaving behind only dust motes dancing in the slanted light of the empty rooms. The house on Raven S. Perch stood silent, a shell waiting to be filled again. The real estate agent, a relentlessly cheerful woman named Brenda, listed it as a Handyman S. dream and ripe with potential. She never mentioned the whispers, the taps, or the way the corn seemed to watch you. Anna found a small apartment in the city. She started sleeping with the lights on and jumped at the sound of rustling leaves from the park below. Eric tried to bury himself in work, but the memory of that fixed grin against the car window was a splinter in his mind that festered. He started having the dream, the one Miller knew too, while the endless rustling stalks and the dry, chattering whispers. One night he broke down and called the deputy. "What were they?" he asked, his voice raw. "What do they want?" Miller was quiet for a long time. He sat in his quiet kitchen, the receiver pressed to his ear. "I don't know," he said finally. "The old stories, they just call them the Reapers. They don't take everyone, just a few. A tithe. The land gives, and the land takes. And Higgins, the farmer, his family has worked that land for generations," Miller said. "They raise the stewards. They prepare the ground." The line went silent. There was nothing more to say. Weeks turned into a month. The FOR sale sign remained, but Brenda was optimistic. A family from out of state was interested. They had 2 young children and a dog. They loved the idea of the corn maze. Miller heard about it through the small-town gossip chain. That afternoon, he drove out to Higgins' farm. He found the old man in his barn, sharpening a scythe with a long, smooth stroke of a whetstone. The metallic hiss was the only sound. "There's a family looking at the house," Miller said, his voice echoing in the vast, dusty space. Higgins didn't he look up. "Land needs tending," he rasped. "It has been a quiet year. It'll be hungry come fall." "You can tea," Miller said, the words feeling useless even as he spoke them. Higgins finally stopped his work and looked at Miller. His eyes were the color of the winter sky, pale and distant. There was no malice in them, only a deep, weary certainty. It's not about can or can tea, deputy. It's about balance. It's always been about balance. You know that. You've seen it. He went back to sharpening the scythe. The sound was rhythmic, final. Miller turned and left. He drove back to town and wrote a letter of resignation. He gave no reason. He packed his things and moved to a coastal town where the soil was sandy and nothing taller than beach grass grew. The new family moved into the house on Raven S. Perch in the summer. The children loved the big backyard. The dog barked at the edge of the cornfield, its fur bristling. The parents laughed it off, calling it a rural mystery. By late September, the corn was high and golden, rustling in the wind. Higgins had outdone himself with the maze. It was more complex than ever, a labyrinth of whispers and shifting shadows. The family hung a sign out front, advertising pumpkins and fresh cider. The harvest was coming. The air was growing cold, and in the depths of the maze, something waited, patient and grinning, for the season to begin again. The first cool evening of autumn found the new family, the Wilsons, sitting around a fire pit in their backyard. Mark Wilson poked the flames with a stick, sending a shower of sparks into the twilight. His wife, Sarah, sipped her wine. Their children, Lily and Sam, chased fireflies near the tree line. Their laughter, a bright counterpoint to the dry rustle of the corn. "It's so peaceful here," Sarah said, leaning back in her Adirondack chair. "Just listen to that." Mark smiled. "It's just the corn, honey. It's what it does." Inside the house, the family dog, a terrier named Buster, began to bark. It was a sharp, frantic sound. He was scratching at the back door. "Buster, quiet," Mark called. The barking stopped, replaced by a low, continuous growl. Sam, the younger child, wandered over to the edge of the lawn where the corn began. He peered into the narrow corridor that served as the maze's entrance. "Mom," he said, his small voice cutting through the night. "I think someone else in there." Sarah stood up. "What do you mean, honey?" "I saw a man. He was smiling at me." A cold knot tightened in Sarah's stomach. She walked over and took Sam's hand, pulling him back toward the fire. "It's just a shadow, sweetie. The maze plays tricks on your eyes." But she looked back at the wall of stalks. For a moment, she thought she saw a pale shape deep within the green, a flicker of movement that was too fluid to be the wind. She shook her head, blaming the wine. Later, after the children were in bed, she mentioned it to Mark. Sam said he saw a man in the maze, smiling. Mark waved a dismissive hand. "Probably old man Higgins checking on his crop. He's a strange bird, but harmless." The next day, Sarah was in the kitchen when she heard a faint, rhythmic sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from the window above the sink. She looked up, expecting to see a branch. There was nothing. The tapping stopped. She went back to washing dishes, her hands submerged in the warm, soapy water. A moment later, a single, ripe ear of corn, still in its husk, landed with a soft thud on the windowsill outside. It hadn't fallen from the sky. It had been placed there. She dried her hands and went outside to get it. The backyard was empty. The corn stood silent. She picked up the ear. It was heavy, perfect. Tucked into the fold of its husk was a small, hand-carved wooden figure. It was a crude representation of a man, his mouth a wide, gouged slash in the wood, frozen in a perpetual grin. She dropped the corn, and the figure as if they were on fire. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She ran inside, locking the door behind her. She told Mark about it when he got home from work. A gift from Higgins, he insisted, though his voice was less certain than before. A weird, backwoods welcome to the neighborhood present. ILL talked to him, but Mark never got the chance. The following evening, as dusk settled, Lily was setting the dinner table. She paused, a fork in her hand, and looked out the dining room window. "Daddy," she said, her voice calm and matter-of-fact. "The corn is closer." Mark and Sarah both looked. The edge of the maze, which had been a good 20 feet from the house, was now only 10. A straight, clean line of stalks had advanced across the lawn, their roots tearing through the grass as if it were paper. Mark grabbed a flashlight and marched outside, his anger overriding his fear. "Higgins," he yelled into the growing dark. "This isn't funny." The only answer was the rustling. It was louder now, a dry, chattering sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once. He shone his light at the new wall of corn. Deep within the thicket, he saw them. Dozens of pale, grinning faces, their dark eyes reflecting the beam back at him. They were not walking. They were growing. They were part of the harvest. He stumbled back into the house, his face ashen. "Get the kids," he said to Sarah, his voice a choked whisper. "We were leaving. Now." But when he tried the phone, the line was dead. And when he ran to the garage, he found all 4 tires on their car slashed. A thick, sap-like substance oozing from the deep cuts. From the kitchen, Sarah screamed. Mark ran back to find her staring out the window above the sink. The entire backyard was gone. In its place stood a solid, impenetrable wall of golden corn, its stalks pressed tight against the glass. The tapping started again, not on one window, but on all of them, a frantic, joyful rhythm. The house was now the heart of the maze, and the reapers had finally come home. The tapping became a pounding, a deafening drumbeat against the windows and doors. The lights flickered, then died, plunging the kitchen into a deep blue twilight. Lily started to cry, a high, thin sound of pure terror. Sam was silent, his small body trembling as he clung to Sarah's leg. Mark grabbed a kitchen knife, its blade looking pathetic and small in the overwhelming noise. "The basement," he shouted over the din. "We can barricade ourselves in the basement." They stumbled through the dark house, the floorboards vibrating under their feet. The front door shuddered in its frame, the wood groaning. Mark yanked open the basement door and pushed his family down the steep wooden stairs. He followed, pulling the door shut behind him and sliding the old, rusty bolt. It was a flimsy thing, but it was all they had. The silence in the basement was a physical relief, thick and heavy, broken only by their ragged breathing and Lily's quiet sobs. The pounding from upstairs was muffled, but it was still there, a constant, insistent reminder of what was outside. "They can't get in here, right, Daddy?" Sam whispered. "Right," Mark said, his voice hollow. He shone his flashlight around the cramped, concrete space. It was filled with the detritus of previous owners, broken furniture, dusty canning jars, a stack of yellowing newspapers. In the corner, something caught his eye. He moved the beam of light over it. It was a small, neat pile of children's toys. A wooden train, a stuffed rabbit, a tin soldier. They were old, covered in a fine layer of dust. And in the center of the pile, just like the corn kernels on Eric's counter, was a single, small, white sneaker. Sarah saw it too and let out a choked gasp, pulling her children closer. "Oh, God, Mark." The pounding upstairs stopped. The sudden silence was more terrifying than the noise had been. They stood frozen in the dark, listening. A new sound began. A soft, scraping drag from the other side of the basement door. Something was coming down the stairs. The old bolt on the door looked impossibly frail. Mark raised his knife, his hand shaking so badly the blade wavered in the flashlight's beam. The scraping reached the bottom of the stairs. It stopped just outside the door. They waited. Seconds stretched into minutes. The only sound was the frantic beating of their own hearts. Then a single, long fingernail slid through the narrow gap between the door and its frame. It tapped gently on the wood. Tap, tap, tap. Lily buried her face in Sarah's stomach, her cries muffled. Sam stared at the door, his eyes wide with an understanding far beyond his years. The doorknob began to turn slowly, deliberately. The rusty bolt groaned in protest. Mark braced himself, ready to lunge at whatever came through. But the door didn't open. Instead, a voice whispered through the keyhole, a dry, rustling sound like corn husks rubbing together. It was a woman's voice, but it held no warmth, no life. "The little ones," it whispered. "The land is hungry for the little ones." The bolt gave way with a sharp, metallic snap. The door swung inward, revealing the dark, empty staircase. But standing in the doorway, silhouetted against the faint light from the house above, was the grinning woman. Her head was cocked to one side, and her dark, empty eyes were fixed on the children. Mark screamed and lunged with the knife. She caught his wrist with impossible speed, her grip like cold iron. The knife clattered to the concrete floor. Her grin widened, a terrifying, fixed rictus. She didn't look at Mark. She only had eyes for Lily and Sam. She took a step into the room, her movement a smooth, unnatural glide. The rustling from the stairs grew louder, filled with a chorus of soft, eager whispers. The harvest was about to begin. Marquette's scream was cut short as another figure, tall and gaunt, emerged from the darkness behind the woman and laid a heavy hand on his shoulder. Mark crumpled to the floor without a sound, his body going limp. Sarah tried to shield the children, pushing them behind her back, but the basement walls seemed to close in. The grinning woman glided closer, her dry, rustling whisper the only sound now. "It is a good season," she hissed, her gaze locked on Sam. From the top of the stairs, a familiar voice, weary and resigned, cut through the tension. "That's enough." Old man Higgins stood on the top step, his figure outlined by the faint moonlight filtering through the house. He held a rusted kerosene lantern in one hand. The grinning woman went still, her head tilting slowly toward him, but her grin never faltered. "The boy is not the one," Higgins said, his voice firm. "The balance is for a life, not for a childhood. You know the pact." The woman's whisper became a low, chattering rattle, like dead leaves skittering across stone. She seemed to disagree. Higgins took a step down, the wooden stair creaking under his weight. "The man," he said, nodding toward Mark's unconscious form. "The father, the provider. His strength will feed the soil for years. The children are for the future. Let them be." A long, silent moment passed. The rustling from the stairs ceased. The woman's dark eyes shifted from Sam to Mark, and then back to Higgins. She gave a slow, deliberate nod. Her form seemed to dissolve, not into nothing, but into the very shadows of the basement, fading until only the memory of her grin remained. Higgins walked down the rest of the stairs, his movements heavy. He ignored Sarah and the children, who were huddled and sobbing. He bent over Mark, checking his pulse with a practiced, impersonal touch. "He'll wake by morning," Higgins said, not looking at Sarah. He won't remember any of this, not clearly. It'll feel like a bad dream. He stood and looked around the basement, his eyes lingering on the pile of toys and the small white sneaker. "You'll leave this place at first light," he instructed. "You'll tell the realtor the house has bad foundations. Damp. You will not speak of this night to anyone." Sarah could only nod, her throat too tight for words. Higgins turned and trudged back up the stairs, leaving the lantern on the bottom step. The light flickered, casting long, dancing shadows. They waited in the silence until Dawn's gray light began to seep under the door. The house was quiet. The corn, when they finally dared to look outside, had receded back to its original boundary. They left that morning, just as Higgins had said. They gave the reason he had provided. The FOR sale sign stayed, and the house on Raven's perch waited once more. Mark never spoke of that night, but he developed a profound, unshakable fear of the dark and the sound of rustling leaves. Sam, however, would sometimes be found in his new backyard, staring intently at a patch of bare earth, a faint, knowing smile on his young face. The real estate agent, Brenda, was undeterred. She listed the property again, this time emphasizing its rustic charm and unparalleled privacy. She never questioned the Wilsons' sudden departure, chalking it up to city folk who couldn't handle the quiet. The house on Raven S. Perch stood empty for another year, the whispers in its walls growing fainter, the patience of the land deepening. Miller, in his coastal town, tried to find peace in the crash of the waves. He took a job as a security guard, the monotony a welcome balm. But he could not escape the dreams. They changed. Instead of the corn, he dreamed of Higgins, standing on the shore, holding a single, perfect ear of corn out toward the sea. The message was clear. There was no escape, only distance. One afternoon, a new family arrived to tour the house. They were younger, with no children, just a pair of enthusiastic German shepherds. The husband was a writer looking for solitude. The wife was a botanist. They saw the potential in the overgrown garden and the sturdy old bones of the house. They were not afraid of a little work. Higgins watched their car crawl up the gravel drive from the edge of his field. He nodded slowly to himself, a grim satisfaction in his pale eyes. The land had been patient. The land had been waiting. It was always waiting. He turned and walked back toward his barn. The scythe needed sharpening. The harvest would come again. Story 3. In the corner of the attic, where the roof slanted down to meet the floorboards, it sat beneath a shroud of dust so thick it seemed less a covering and more a part of the object itself, a sedimentary layer of forgotten time. It was a jack-o'-lantern, but not the cheerful, plump kind sold at roadside stands. This one was carved from a gourd long past its prime, shrunken and withered, its skin the color of a day-old bruise. The face cut into its side was not a simple triangle-eyed grin, but a rictus of agony, a silent scream frozen in vegetable flesh. A single, long-dead candle, its wax pooled and blackened at the bottom, stood within. It looked as though it had been waiting, patient and malevolent, for someone to remember it was there. Lexi saw it the moment she pushed open the attic hatch, the beam of her flashlight slicing through the motes of disturbed dust. It was an afterthought in her investigation, this search of the parents' attic. The official file on Maya Llewellyn, age 8, missing since last Halloween, was closed. A runaway, they said, though runaways of 8 are rare. A tragedy in the woods behind the house, they presumed, though no body was ever found. The parents, hollowed out by a year of grief, had hired Lexi as a last, desperate act of faith. They believed she had a knack for finding what was lost, a sensitivity to the whispers the world left behind. It was a kindness, they told themselves. Lexi knew it was more of a curse. She was a private investigator whose own life had developed the fragile, cracked quality of old porcelain. Her apartment was a landscape of case files and takeout containers. Her sleep, a shallow pool troubled by the faces of the people she failed to find. She carried the cold of October not just in her bones, but in her soul, a permanent early twilight. And now, with the Halloween season descending upon the town of Silver S. Hollow once more. That cold was deepening. The days bled together, a countdown in dying leaves. It was October 28th. The air was sharp with the smell of wood smoke and decay. On every porch, new jack-o'-lanterns glowed, their candlelit faces beaming out into the encroaching dark. Children, buzzing with a sugar-fueled hysteria, practiced their roots, their costumes rustling like the dried corn stalks tied to every lamppost. Lexi walked through streets transformed, where familiar houses became alien fortresses draped in synthetic cobwebs, their grinning plastic skeletons seeming to track her progress with painted eyes. The festive atmosphere felt like a thin veneer over something ancient and deeply afraid. Her investigation was a ghost, haunting the edges of the town's preparations. She interviewed teachers, neighbors, friends. Everyone remembered Maya. A quiet girl, they said, loved Halloween, had been so excited to be a witch. The story was always the same, until she spoke to an old woman named Agnes, who lived in a house that smelled of cat pee and cinnamon, and who claimed to be the last practicing wise woman in Silver S. Hollow. "The veil is thin here," Agnes whispered, her gnarled hands sorting dried herbs on her kitchen table. The window behind her framed a sky the color of a fresh bruise. Always has been. The old ones knew. They built this town on a crossroads of ley lines. Halloween isn't just a night for candy here, girl. It has a door, and some people know how to open it. Agnes spoke of a group, not a coven, but a club. The Harvest Guild, they called themselves. The town's most respectable citizens, the mayor, a prominent surgeon, the bank manager. They were pillars, their faces smiling from community newsletters. But Agnes's voice dropped to a conspiratorial rasp. They have a different kind of harvest. They don't reap corn. They reap belief. The pure, terrified belief of a child on Halloween night. It's a vintage to them. A power. Lexi left feeling unsettled, dismissing it as the ramblings of a superstitious old woman. But the words stuck to her, like the sticky residue of a candy apple. That night, going through the evidence box from the original investigation, she found a Polaroid of Maya, taken just hours before she vanished. She was in her witch costume, a cheap black dress and pointed hat, standing proudly next to her jack-o'-lantern. And the jack-o'-lantern, Lexi realized with a cold knot tightening in her stomach, was identical to the withered, screaming one in the Llewellyn's attic, October 29th. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of children's laughter that sometimes broke into screams that were a little too sharp. The moon, a great lopsided orange, hung low in the sky. Lexi dug deeper, using back channels and calling in favors. She found a pattern, a ghost in the machine of municipal records. Every 5 to 7 years, for the past half-century, a child had vanished in Silver S. Hollow on Halloween night. The cases were all different: a presumed drowning, a lost hiker, a runaway, but the rhythm was there. A slow, malignant heartbeat under the town's idyllic surface. The years of the disappearances coincided with the terms of the current Harvest Guild members. Her fragile balance began to fracture. Sleep abandoned her completely. The flickering jack-o'-lanterns on neighboring porches seemed to watch her as she came home late, their light pulsing like a warning. She started seeing a tall, gaunt scarecrow standing at the edge of the cornfield behind her apartment. It hadn't been there yesterday. Its burlap face was blank, but she felt its attention like a physical weight. She went to the police, to a detective named Miller who had humored her before. She laid out her theory, the pattern, the guild. He listened, his expression patient, until she mentioned Agnes and the idea of harvesting belief. "Lexi," he said, his voice gentle in a way that felt condescending. "You've been under a lot of stress. This case, it's getting to you. Missing kids, it does that. It makes you see monsters in the shadows. What if the monsters are the ones who put the shadows there, detective?" She asked, her voice quiet. "What if they were the ones carving the pumpkins?" He dismissed her. They always did. The predators hid in plain sight, their respectability a shield more impenetrable than any mask. October 30th. The day was unnaturally still and cold, the sky a flat, iron gray. The festive atmosphere curdled, the decorations taking on a sinister aspect. The plastic skeletons seemed less like toys and more like premonitions. That afternoon, Lexi found a small, perfect candy apple left on her doorstep. It was glossy and red, like a poisoned gift from a fairy tale. There was no note. She threw it into the woods, her hands trembling, driven by a fear that was rapidly solidifying into certainty. She broke into the Historical Society after dark. In the basement archives, she found them. The records of the Harvest Guild, minutes from their meetings, written in a coded, florid script that spoke of the great reaping and the sowing of fear. They referenced a vessel, a chosen child whose terror on the liminal night would fertilize the fields of their ambition for another cycle. It was all metaphor until she found the illustrations, diagrams of a ritual. And in the center of each diagram was a specific, grotesquely carved jack-o'-lantern. The vessel S lantern. It was a focus, a conduit. The child S fear, magnified by the ancient magic of the thinned veil, was channeled through it, and the guild fed on it, drawing longevity, influence, and a warped kind of power. Maya Llewellyn had been last year's chosen vessel. And the ritual was always held in the old Grange Hall on the outskirts of town, a place now used for the annual Halloween charity ball, an event hosted by none other than the Harvest Guild. Halloween night arrived. It came not as a holiday, but as a judgment. The air was thick with a creeping, supernatural fog that mingled with the exhaust of fog machines, creating a miasma that blurred the line between the manufactured and the real. At 5 o'clock, the streetlights flickered on, casting a sickly orange glow on the swarms of trick-or-treaters. They were a river of tiny ghosts and superheroes, their laughter echoing with an unnerving, metallic ring. Lexi moved among them, invisible in her own plain clothes, a ghost haunting the haunt. She She carried the withered jack-o'-lantern from the attic in a duffel bag. It felt warm against her back, as if the dead candle inside had ignited of its own accord. She knew what she had to do. The ritual would require a new vessel, a new child to be this year's sacrifice. She had to stop it. She had to break the cycle. The Grange Hall was a blaze of light at the end of a long, maple-lined drive. Costumed figures, elegant vampires, glittering witches, politicians milled about on the manicured lawn, their laughter brittle and sharp. Lexi slipped around the back, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She found a service entrance and picked the lock with practiced, shaking hands. Inside, the noise of the party was a distant hum. She followed a descending corridor, the air growing colder with each step. The walls, once plain cinder block, became rough-hewn stone. She was in a part of the building that didn't exist on any blueprint, a secret chamber that had been here long before the Grange was built. The door at the end was heavy oak, banded with iron. Through a crack, she saw them, the Harvest Guild. They wore their expensive suits and gowns, but over them they wore masks. Not store-bought monstrosities, but ancient, handcrafted things of wood and bone and dried corn husk. They were gathered in a circle around a stone altar. On the altar sat a new jack-o'-lantern, its face carved into the same silent scream as the one in her bag. And beside it, tied with silken cords, was a small boy in a pirate costume. He was crying, his sobs the only human sound in the room. Mayor Griffiths, his face hidden behind a mask of gilded oak, raised a ceremonial knife. "The fields are fallow," he intoned, his voice resonant and wrong. "The soil requires a new seed. Let the vessel's fear flow, that we may reap the harvest." Lexi didn't think. She kicked the door open. The masked faces turned to her, not with shock, but with a kind of weary annoyance. She threw the duffel bag onto the floor, and the withered jack-o'-lantern rolled out, coming to rest at the base of the altar. "It is over," she said, her voice sounding small in the vast, cold space. Surgeon Evans, his mask a thing of bleached animal bone, laughed. "Oh, investigator, you are too late, and you are just in time. You see, the ritual requires a focus, a conduit for the terror. But the fear of one child is a delicate wine. The raw, raging terror of an adult, a believer who has seen the truth that is a vintage of unparalleled potency." He gestured, and the withered jack-o'-lantern at her feet began to glow. Not with candlelight, but with a sickly, phosphorescent green. A wave of pure, undiluted dread washed over her, a psychic nausea that buckled her knees. It was Maya's fear, a year old, preserved, and now mingling with her own. She saw flashes of what the little girl had seen the leering masks, the cold stone, the glint of the knife, all superimposed over the present moment. The guild members began to chant, their voices a low drone that vibrated in her teeth. The green light from the old pumpkin intensified, and she felt something being pulled from her, a vital energy, her sanity, her very self. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the chanting. The new pumpkin on the altar began to glow in sympathy, its scream-shaped mouth opening like a void. The last thing she saw clearly was the little pirate boy, his eyes wide with a terror that was now being siphoned away, redirected into her. She had become the vessel. The world dissolved into a smear of orange and black. The chanting became the rustle of dead leaves. The cold stone floor became the damp earth of a November grave. Her mind, unable to hold the violation, began to break, to fold in on itself, seeking shelter in a time before the horror. She is running. The air is warm, smelling of cut grass and gasoline, the suburban perfume of a long-lost summer. She is small, her bare feet slapping against the hot pavement. She is chasing fireflies, their lights blinking in the twilight like tiny, friendly stars. Her father is calling her name from the porch, his voice a beacon of safety. "Lexi, time to come in." She laughs, the sound clear and unburdened, a bell ringing in the innocent air. She turns to run home, the firefly cupped gently in her hands, a captured piece of light. The memory is a perfect, sealed globe. She retreats into it, the sounds of the ritual fading, the green light dimming, the cold receding. The details are so vivid, the texture of the concrete, the weight of the firefly, the love in her father's voice. It is a good place. It is safe here. She lets herself sink deeper, the investigator, the cases, the jack-o'-lanterns, the Harvest Guild, all of it just a bad dream, a shadow at the edge of a much brighter, warmer day. She is Lexi. She is 7 years old, and she is running home. She holds on to that. It is all she has left. It is everything. The firefly pulsed once, a soft yellow-green against her palm, and then the memory began to curdle. The warm twilight air grew cold, leaching the summer heat away in a single, sickening breath. The scent of cut grass twisted into the smell of damp stone and old, cold wax. Her father's voice calling her name stretched, thinning into the drone of the Harvest Guild's chant. No, she thought, a desperate, childish denial. No, I want to go home. But the memory was a photograph burning at the edges. The firefly in her hand was not a firefly at all. It was the withered jack-o'-lantern, glowing with that same sickly phosphorescence, its scream a silent vibration that shook her bones. The warmth she felt was not the summer sun, but the last of her own life force being drawn out of her, siphoned through the ancient gourd and into the waiting, masked figures. She was on her knees on the stone floor, the duffel bag a limp puddle beside her. The little pirate boy was still on the altar, but he was no longer crying. He was staring at her, his eyes wide with a confusion that was somehow worse than terror. The Guild's chant reached a crescendo, and the new pumpkin on the altar flared with a light so bright it was black, a void of pure anti-light that drank the very sight from her eyes. In that final moment of dissolution, a shard of the investigator she had been, the woman who chased whispers and looked into shadows, reasserted itself. It was a cold, hard sliver of purpose. If she was to be the vessel, then she would be a poisoned one. She focused not on her own fear, but on the one thing she had left, the truth, She gathered the cold, hard facts of the pattern, the names of the missing children, the faces of the guild members beneath their masks. She wrapped this knowledge in the white-hot fury of what they had done to Maya, to all of them, and she pushed it all down the conduit, back along the line of green light, connecting her to the withered pumpkin. The pumpkin shuddered. A web of cracks appeared on its bruised surface. The Guild S chant faltered. Mayor Griffiths, the ceremonial knife still raised, took a step back. The green light flickered, strobing the chamber in jagged snapshots of masked confusion. From the withered pumpkin-'s screaming mouth came a sound, not a scream, but a whisper, a chorus of whispers. It was the names: Emily, Thomas, Sarah, Maya. They were spoken in 100 different tones, a sigh, a sob, a question, a curse. The whispers filled the room, weaving through the chant, unraveling it. The new pumpkin on the altar cracked open with a sound like a gunshot. The black light winked out. The silken cords holding the pirate boy fell away, disintegrated into dust. The guild members stared, their ritual broken. The flow of power had not just stopped, it had reversed. The preserved terror of decades, the harvested belief, was now flooding back into them, unfiltered, raw, and poisoned with the truth of their own deeds. Surgeon Evans clawed at his bone mask, a raw, guttural scream tearing from his throat. The bank manager, Mrs. Albright, collapsed, her cornhusk mask crumbling as she wept, great, heaving sobs of a grief not her own. Lexi lay on the cold stone, empty and broken. The world was a gray, muffled place. She could hear shouts, the pounding of feet the partygoers from above, drawn by the commotion. The door burst open, and figures in costumes flooded the secret chamber, their festive masks now witnessing a horror they could not comprehend. Detective Miller was among them. He saw the scene: the altar, the crying boy, the broken pumpkins, the town's most respected citizens weeping and writhing on the floor. His eyes found Lexi. He rushed to her side, his face a mask of its own, one of dawning, terrible understanding. She tried to speak, to tell him about the fireflies, about how she needed to get home before dark. But the words wouldn't come. The only thing that escaped was a whisper, the last name from the pumpkin's mouth, her own, Lexi. And as the detective cradled her head, shouting for an ambulance, the only thing she was certain of was the cold. It was the deep, permanent cold of a Halloween that had finally, and forever, seeped into her soul. Outside, the town of Silver S. Hollow celebrated, unaware that the door had been slammed shut, the harvest spoiled, and the cost had been paid in full by the woman who had gone into the dark to find a lost girl, and had instead found herself. He kept her in the hospital for 3 days. The doctors called it acute shock, a psychotic break brought on by stress and exhaustion. They wanted to transfer her to a psychiatric facility, upstate. Miller, his face grim and older than she remembered, signed the release forms himself. He drove her home in silence, the unspoken truth a heavy fog in the car. Her apartment was exactly as she had left it, but it felt like a museum exhibit of a life that no longer belonged to her. The case files were still spread across her kitchen table. She looked at the photo of Maya Llewellyn and felt nothing, a hollowed-out echo where her determination used to be. Following week, the headlines began. Mayor Griffiths checked into a private rehabilitation clinic for what was described as a severe nervous breakdown. Surgeon Evans abruptly resigned from the hospital, citing undisclosed health reasons. The town was buzzing with a low, confused hum of scandal. There were no arrests, no official statements. The story was too strange, the evidence too esoteric. The Harvest Guild was dismantled not by the law, but by the psychic backlash of its own corrupted ritual. Miller came to see her one last time. He stood awkwardly in her doorway, holding his hat in his hands. "They're talking," he said. "Albright, the bank manager, she won't stop talking. She's in a home now. She keeps babbling about lanterns and stolen years. The official report will call it a kidnapping attempt, foiled by a disturbed private investigator. It's the best I can do." Lexi just nodded. It didn't matter. The words were just sounds. "The boy," Miller added, his voice softening. "The pirate. He doesn't remember anything. Just that a nice lady with sad eyes helped him find his mom." She closed the door without saying goodbye. The world outside her window was preparing for Thanksgiving, but the cheerful oranges and reds of autumn seemed garish and false to her now. The veil had been torn, and for Lexi, it had never mended. She could no longer tell where the memory ended and the nightmare began. The smell of cinnamon made her flinch. The sight of a pumpkin, even a whole one, sent a tremor through her hands. She spent her days in a quiet, gray haze. She was 7 years old, lost in a perpetual twilight, always running, the cold at her heels. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would wake up, and for a single, heart-stopping moment, she would feel the warm, pulsing light of the firefly in her hand. Then the feeling would fade, leaving only the chill of the stone floor and the ghost of a scream carved into a gourd. She had broken the cycle, saved a child, and exposed the monsters. But the cost was the woman she had been. She had looked into the void, and a piece of it had stayed behind her eyes, a permanent resident in the hollowed-out spaces of Silver's Hollow. The silence in her apartment became a physical presence, a thick dust that settled over everything, including her. She stopped answering the phone. The mail piled up behind the door. The world had moved on to Christmas, the twinkling lights and saccharine music, a new kind of assault. They were just more masks, she thought, hiding a deeper, colder dark. One afternoon, a small, plain package arrived. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in unbleached cotton, was a small, smooth river stone, dark gray and cool to the touch. With it was a single, handwritten note on a piece of cardstock. It read, for grounding. When the memories feel like they're going to pull you under, hold on to this. It was unsigned. She didn't know who had sent it. Miller, perhaps, in a final, awkward gesture of understanding. Or maybe it was from the family of the pirate boy, a silent thank you from a world that would never know what she had done. It didn't matter. She picked up the stone. Its weight was solid, real, an anchor in the shifting sea of her mind. She began carrying it with her fingers curling around its smooth surface whenever the panic began to rise. It didn't fix her. The cold was still there. The fractured memories still vied for dominance. But the stone was a fact. It was a thing that existed wholly in the present, with no past of terror and no future of dread. Weeks turned into a brittle, cold month. On a day when the sky was the color of lead and the first flurries of snow were beginning to fall, she found herself standing in front of the Historical Society. It was closed, a chain across the door. She walked around to the back, to the window of the basement archives she had broken. It had been repaired. She took the stone from her pocket and held it tight. Then she turned and walked away, her breath pluming in the frigid air. She was not the investigator anymore. She was not the little girl chasing fireflies. She was a woman with a cold stone in her hand, walking through a silent winter town. It was not a victory. It was not a defeat. It was just what was left. And for now, that was enough. The snow began to fall in earnest, thick, silent flakes that coated the streets of Silver S. Hollow in a clean, white shroud. She walked without a destination, the stone a hard, smooth truth in her palm. The Christmas lights on the lampposts were haloed in the falling snow, their cheer muted and distant, like a celebration happening in another town. She found herself at the edge of the old park, where the maple trees stood skeletal and black against the white sky. The playground was empty, the swings dusted with snow, frozen in mid-arc. This was where she had chased the fireflies. This was the patch of grass that had once been warm under her bare feet. The memory was there, but it was like a page from a book she had read long ago. The emotions were flat, the colors dim. A figure was sitting on one of the frozen swings, a dark silhouette in the gathering twilight. As she drew closer, she saw it was an old woman, bundled in a heavy wool coat, her hands tucked into her sleeves. She was gently pushing herself back and forth with the tip of her boot, the swing S chains groaning softly in the cold. The woman looked up as Lexi approached. Her face was a web of fine lines, but her eyes were clear and sharp, the color of a winter sky. They held a knowing that made Lexi S. breath catch. "You Ray the one," the woman said. Her voice was dry, like the rustle of old leaves. Lexi stopped a few feet away, her fingers tightening around the stone. She said nothing. They thought they could control it. The woman continued, looking out across the white field. "My grandfather was a founding member, a Griffiths. They believed the ritual was a transaction, a life for a bounty. But hunger like that it is not a partner, it is a master." She turned her gaze back to Lexi. "You didn't just break their ritual. You broke their bargain. You showed the hunger that its feeders were weak. It has turned its face away from this place." The words should have brought comfort, a sense of closure. Instead, A deeper chill settled in Lexi's bones. The hunger was real. It was a thing that could turn its face away. And she had looked directly into it. What was it? Lexi asked, her own voice a stranger S, hoarse from disuse. The old woman smiled, a thin, sorrowful curve of her lips. Older than the corn, older than the stones. It is the cold that comes before the winter, the silence after the last leaf falls. It doesn't have a name. It simply is. She stood up from the swing, her joints cracking in the frozen air. She looked at the stone in Lexi's hand. That S, a good thing you have there. It S from the creek behind my house. It has never been hungry. The old woman began to walk away, her footsteps silent in the snow. After a few paces, she paused and glanced back. It has gone from here. But a turned face is not a blind one. You carry a piece of the cold with you now. It has your burden and your protection. Lexi watched her go until she was just a dark speck against the endless white. The snow fell, erasing the woman's footprints as if she had never been. Lexi looked down at the stone in her hand, then out at the empty park, at the town beyond. It was over, truly over. The cycle was broken, the entity spurned. She had saved them all, and she was alone in the quiet, with a cold that was now her own. She turned and walked toward the distant lights of the town, a solitary figure in the falling snow. The weight of the stone in her pocket, the only proof she had that any of it had been real. The walk home was a long, slow immersion into the mundane. Cars hissed by on wet pavement, their headlights cutting through the swirling snow. People hurried along the sidewalks, their heads down against the wind, their lives simple and concerned with the weather, with getting home, with dinner. She moved through them like a ghost, the old woman's words echoing in the hollow spaces the ritual had carved out. You carry a piece of the cold with you now. It was not a metaphor. She could feel it, a core of perpetual winter nestled just behind her sternum. It was the cold of the stone floor, the cold of the November earth, the cold of the thing that had turned its face away. It did not hurt. It was simply a fact, as the stone in her pocket was a fact. When she reached her apartment building, she saw that someone had strung a single, pathetic strand of colored lights along the railing. They blinked red, green, blue, their cheer a desperate, fragile thing against the encroaching night. She climbed the stairs, each step a conscious effort, and unlocked her door. The warmth inside was a shock, but it was a surface warmth. It did not penetrate. She stood for a long time in the middle of the living room, her coat dripping onto the floor, and looked at the life she had built. The case files, the books, the half-empty coffee mug still on the counter from a lifetime ago. It was all evidence of a person who no longer existed. She took the stone from her pocket and placed it on the kitchen table. It looked like just a rock, but it was the most real thing in the room. Days bled into one another. The snow fell and melted and fell again. she started to go through the motions. She paid her bills. She bought groceries, moving through the brightly lit aisles of the supermarket with a detached efficiency, her cart filled with simple, sustaining foods. She did not look at the seasonal aisle, where the last of the pumpkins had been cleared away to make room for baking supplies. One evening, the phone rang. She let it go to the machine, as she always did. But this time, the voice that spoke after the beep was not a telemarketer or a wrong number. "Miss Croft, this is Alina Llewellyn, Maya S. mother." Lexi froze, her hand hovering over the river stone where it sat on the table. I don't know if you remember me. The police said you were unwell, but I needed to call. Maya, she had a dream last night. She said a lady with cold hands stood in her room and told her she was safe now, that the bad harvest was over. There was a long, shaky breath on the line. I know it sounds crazy, but she hasn't had a nightmare since. She S like her old self. I just thank you. Whatever you did, thank you. The line went dead. Lexi looked down at her own hands. They were pale, the veins blue against the skin. They were always cold now. She had not stood in Maya Llewellyn's room, but a part of her, the cold, knowing part, understood. The ritual had left a residue, a connection. The comfort she had poured into the conduit, the truth she had used to poison the harvest, it had found its way to the girl who had started it all. It was not a happy thought. It was just another fact. The cold inside her had a purpose. It was a shield and a warning and a reminder. The hunger was gone from Silver's hollow, but it existed, and she existed as its counterweight. She picked up the stone, its solidity a comfort. The night outside her window was vast and black, but for the first time since the ritual, it felt like it was just the night. And she was just a woman, sitting in a quiet room, waiting for the morning. The morning came, gray and slow. She made tea, the steam rising in a thin plume that seemed to shy away from her. She held the mug, not for its warmth, but for the simple ritual of it. The phone call from Alina Llewellyn had settled something in her, a final piece of a terrible puzzle clicking into place. She was not healing. She was adapting. The cold was a part of her anatomy now, like a spine. A few weeks later, a formal-looking envelope arrived. It was from a law firm in the city. Inside was a brief, typewritten letter and a cashier's check for a significant amount of money. The letter stated that it was the final payment for services rendered to the Llewellyn family per the original contract. There was no personal note. It was clean, professional, and severing. She stared at the check. It was blood money in the most literal sense she could imagine. It was payment for walking into the dark and coming back altered. She could not cash it, but she could not throw it away. It was another fact, another piece of evidence. She placed it in a drawer underneath the river stone. Life in Silver's hollow, on the surface, normalized. The scandals faded into whispers, and the whispers into forgotten history. Mayor Griffiths never returned from his clinic. A new, younger council member was appointed. The town, relieved, embraced the change. The cycle of seasons turned, indifferent. The snow melted, revealing the muddy ground beneath. One afternoon in early spring, she was walking back from the grocery store when she saw him, Detective Miller. He was getting out of his car in front of the diner. He saw her at the same time, and for a moment, they were both frozen in the pale sunlight. He looked tired. He gave her a small, slow nod, an acknowledgement that held no expectation of conversation. She returned the nod, and then she walked on. It was enough. They were two people who knew a thing that would forever separate them from everyone else. And that knowledge was a wall between them, as much as it was a bond. She reached her apartment and put the groceries away. The silence was different today. It was not empty. It was waiting. She went to the drawer and took out the check and the stone. She held them both, one in each hand. One was paper, a promise of a life that could be rebuilt somewhere else. The other was stone, a promise of nothing but its own weight. She knew then that she would not be cashing the check. She would not be leaving Silver's Hollow. This was the ground zero of her new existence. The cold in her chest was a compass needle, and it pointed only here to this town, to this quiet. She was the warden of a silence she had created. She was the scar tissue over a wound that had once fed a god. And as long as she stayed, the door would remain shut. She put the stone back in her pocket. It felt right. She looked out the window at the town, no longer with grief or fear, but with a stark, cold clarity. It was her charge. It was her hollow. And she was its keeper. The first dandelions appeared, little yellow suns pushing through the cracks in the pavement. Children's laughter echoed from the park again, a sound that no longer made her flinch, but that she observed from a great distance, as if through a thick pane of glass. She started taking long walks, not for pleasure, but as a form of patrol. She would walk past the Historical Society, its windows dark and quiet. She would walk past the mayor's old house, now occupied by a young family from out of state. She would walk to the edge of town where the fields began, and she would stand there until the last light faded from the sky. The stone was always in her pocket. The cold was always in her chest. They were her constants. One evening, on her way back from the fields, she saw a firefly. It was early for them, a lone pioneer blinking in the deep blue twilight. A normal person would have felt a flicker of nostalgia, a simple appreciation for a summer night's beauty. Lexi felt nothing but a profound, chilling recognition. She did not see a harmless insect. She saw a tiny, pulsing lantern in the vast and hungry dark. She watched it until it vanished into the shadows beneath the trees. She understood then that the old woman had been wrong about one thing. The hunger had not simply turned its face away. It had left a sentinel. It had left her. She was the cold that kept the true cold at bay. She was the silence that prevented a deeper silence from falling. When she got home, she did not turn on the lights. She stood in the dark of her living room, looking at the faint reflection of the moon in the window. She was not a hero. She was not a victim. She was a fixture, as necessary and unthinking as a stone wall. She took the river stone from her pocket and placed it on the windowsill, a small, dark shape against the glass. It was not a weapon. It was not a comfort. It was a marker. It was here. She was here. And for now, and for all the nights to come, that was the only truth that mattered. The summer heat arrived. A thick, humid blanket that lay over Silver's Hollow. People complained about the mugginess, fanning themselves on their porches in the evenings. Lexi felt none of it. The heat broke against the cold inside her, leaving her perpetually in a state of mild, dry coolness. She was an island in the sweltering town. She began to notice small things. A patch of blackberries at the edge of the woods that ripened weeks earlier than anywhere else. A particular corner in the park where the dandelions never went to seed, their yellow heads perpetually bright. These were not places of magic, but of stillness. The hunger was gone, but its absence had left pockets of quiet, and life behaved differently in them. She was drawn to these spots, finding a strange solace in their unnatural calm. One day, a woman approached her in the grocery store. She was young, with a tired face and a toddler on her hip. "Excuse me," she said, her voice hesitant. "You're Lexi Croft, right?" Lexi nodded, her hand closing around the stone in her pocket. "I'm Sarah. We moved into the old Griffiths place." She shifted the child on her hip. "This is going to sound weird, but my son, he has terrible nightmares. Has since we moved in. But last week, he said a quiet lady stood in his room and the bad dreams went away. He described you." Lexi said nothing. She had never been to the Griffiths' house. Sarah looked down, embarrassed. "I know it's just a kid's imagination, but he's been sleeping through the night. I felt like I had to thank you. People in town, they say you understand things." Lexi looked at the little boy. He stared back at her with wide, unblinking eyes, then gave her a small, shy smile. She felt a faint, distant echo of the cold in her chest shift. Not a thaw, but a gentle reorientation, like a compass needle finding a new pole. "You're welcome," Lexi said, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. She walked home, the encounter replaying in her mind. It was not a coincidence. The cold inside her was not passive. It was seeping into the foundations of the town, a subtle antidote to a poison that had long since been drained. She was not just a warden. She was becoming part of the ecosystem, a natural feature that brought a certain kind of balance. That night, she did not place the stone on the windowsill. She kept it in her hand as she sat in the dark. The void behind her eyes felt less like an empty space and more like a watchful one. She had looked into the hunger, and a piece of it had stayed. But she had also left a piece of herself in the void. They were mirrored, she and it, forever linked by the breach she had torn open. The fireflies were thick in the fields now, their collective glow a false, cheerful constellation. Lexi watched them from her window, the river stone cool and steady in her palm. She was not waiting for morning anymore. She was waiting for nothing at all. She was simply here, and in the deep, quiet places of Silver's Hollow, that was everything. The autumn came, and with it, a sharpness to the air that felt more familiar to her than the summer's warmth ever had. the leaves turned, a brilliant, fiery death that she observed with the same detached clarity she gave to everything. Children carved pumpkins on porches, their jagged smiles lit from within by candles. She walked past them in the evenings, a fleeting shadow, and noticed that the candles never flickered as she passed. The flame simply steadied, as if holding its breath. The stone in her pocket was smoother now, worn by the constant, absent-minded pressure of her fingers. It was a worry stone for a worry that had no name. She found herself walking more frequently to the old park, to the frozen swing where she had met the old woman. It was empty, of course, but the silence there was different. It was a clean silence, a silence that had been earned. One night, a night so still the stars looked like chips of ice fixed in the black velvet of the sky, she heard a sound she had not heard since the ritual. It was the low, mournful cry of the train horn, miles away, carried on the wind. It was a sound that had once been a herald, a call to the old hunger. She stood on her small balcony, the cold metal of the railing seeping into her palms, and listened. The sound did not stir the cold inside her. It did not make it grow. Instead, the cold seemed to listen too. It was a recognition, an acknowledgement of a distant cousin. The horn faded, and the silence that returned was deeper and more complete than before. It was the silence of a threat that had passed by on a track far away, a threat that knew better than to stop here. She looked down at the town, at the warm, lit windows of houses where people lived their simple, unburdened lives. They would never know how close the train had come, or why it had not stopped. They would never know the price of their peace, paid in the cold that lived inside a solitary woman on a balcony. She went inside and closed the door. The apartment was dark. She did not need light to see. She took the stone from her pocket and held it in both hands, not for comfort, but for focus. She closed her eyes and looked inward at the core of winter she carried. It was not a void. It was a presence. It was her. And for the first time, the thought was not a burden, but a simple, unadorned truth. She was the quiet at the end of the bad dream. She was the stillness in the heart of the storm. She was Lexi Croft of Silver's Hollow. And that was all she would ever need to be. The first frost came, etching delicate, feathery patterns on her window pane. She watched its progress each morning, a new and intricate map of the cold she knew so intimately. The town began its slow descent into winter hibernation, and Lexi found her rhythms syncing with the season. Her walks grew longer as the days grew shorter, her path a worn circuit through the sleeping streets. People had stopped looking at her with pity or suspicion. Now, their glances were fleeting, almost respectful, the way one might regard a familiar landmark. They did not approach her again, as Sarah had. The word had spread in that quiet way of small towns that some things were best left unspoken. Her presence was a settled fact, like the old oak in the town square or the creek that ran behind the school. One Tuesday, the library called. Her hold on an obscure historical text about regional geology had come in. Mrs. Albright, the librarian, was a woman in her 70s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. As she scanned the book, she looked up at Lexi. "You're the one who likes rocks," she stated, not asked. Lexi nodded. Mrs. Albright slid the book across the counter. "There's a chapter on river stones. Page 117. Thought it might interest you." She paused, her gaze lingering on Lexi's hands, which rested calmly on the counter. "My grandmother used to say that a stone from a certain place could hold the memory of that place. Keep you grounded." Lexi met her eyes. There was no fear in them, only a deep, knowing curiosity. "Some stones are heavier than others," Lexi replied. A slow smile touched Mrs. Albright's lips. "Indeed they are." It was the first real conversation Lexi had had in months that did not feel like an intrusion. She read the book that night. The chapter was dry and academic, discussing mineral composition and glacial deposits. But one line near the end stood out. "In certain folklore, stones that have lain at a river source are considered anchors, not just of the physical world, but of the spiritual one, tethering the ephemeral to the earth." She looked at her own stone, sitting on the table. It had never been near a river source. It had been born in a place of pure hunger. But it was an anchor all the same. It anchored her to her duty, to the silence, to the cold. It was the weight that kept her from simply floating away into the vast, star-dusted emptiness she felt on the clearest nights. Winter solidified its grip, and a deep snow fell, muffling the world. On the shortest day of the year, the solstice, Lexi walked to the park at midnight. The snow glowed with a faint, blue-white luminescence under the starlight. She stood in the center of the field, the same spot where the old woman had vanished, and she simply existed. She felt the town around her, sleeping, dreaming its simple dreams. She felt the deep, patient cold of the earth beneath the snow, and she felt her own cold, a perfect, seamless match. She did not speak any words. She made no gestures. She was just a woman in a white field under a black sky. But in that moment, she was performing the most essential ritual of all. She was remembering. She was standing watch. The stone was in her pocket, a small, dense promise in the immense and silent dark. The night was long, but she was longer. And she was not afraid. The snow began to fall again, soft and soundless, adding another layer to the world's quiet. She stood there until her hair was dusted white, and the cold outside felt no different from the cold within. It was a perfect equilibrium. When she finally turned to walk home, her footprints were the only blemish on the pristine field, a slow, deliberate trail leading back to a single, dark apartment. The next morning, a package was leaning against her door. It was a simple cardboard box, no return address. Inside, nestled in unbleached cotton, was a new stone. It was darker than hers, almost black, and striated with thin, white lines like frozen lightning. There was no note. She picked it up. It was not cold. It held a different quality, a deep, resonant stillness that seemed to absorb the very idea of sound. She knew who it was from. Mrs. Albright, the librarian. A gift from one anchor to another. Lexi Lexi placed the new stone on the windowsill beside the first. They were not alike, but they were a pair. One from the void, one from the earth. Together, they framed a view of the town she kept. She looked at them, then out at the snow-blanketed streets. The silence was no longer something she guarded. It was something she shared. The thought was neither warm nor cold. It was, like everything else now, simply true. The days began to lengthen, the sun gaining a fraction of strength each afternoon, but the deep cold held fast. It was a cold that Lexi understood. It was not the harsh, killing cold of the thing that had been in the woods, but a preserving cold, the kind that keeps the roots of things alive until the true thaw. Her walks continued, her path now including a slow circuit past the library. She never went in, but sometimes she would see Mrs. Albright through the window sorting books at her desk. Their eyes would meet, and the old woman would give a slow, almost imperceptible nod. It was a report. All is quiet. One afternoon, she found a small bunch of early snowdrops, their white heads bowed, lying on her doorstep. She picked them up. They were cool and fragile in her hand. She did not know who had left them, and she found she did not need to. The gesture was not one of friendship, but of acknowledgement. She took them inside and put them in a glass of water on the table between the two stones. They were a third point on a map she was only just learning to read. That night she dreamed. It was not a dream of darkness or hunger, but of geography. She was standing on a vast, featureless plain under a sky of muted gray. Before her were two paths. One was paved with smooth, dark river stones, leading into a deep, tranquil mist. The other was a narrow track of hard-packed earth, glittering with flecks of mica, leading toward a range of low, rolling hills. She was not being asked to choose. She was simply being shown the territory. She was the plain. She was the sky. She was the point from which the paths diverged. She woke not with a start, but with a slow, deliberate return to consciousness. The first light of dawn was gray at the window. The snowdrops in the glass had opened fully during the night, their pure white a stark contrast to the dark wood of the table. She looked from them to the stones on the sill, the anchor from the void, the anchor from the earth, and now the fleeting life that persisted between them. She rose and dressed. The cold in her chest was a steady, humming frequency. She put the original stone, her stone, into her pocket. She left the new, dark one on the sill, a sentinel for the home she had made of her solitude. Then she went out into the morning. The town was not her burden. It was not her charge. It was her landscape. She walked its streets not as a warden, but as a feature of the terrain, as natural and as unyielding as the bedrock beneath the frost. The cold was not a scar. It was a mineral composition. She was not a keeper of silence. She was the silence, given form and purpose, and as her feet crunched on the frozen gravel at the edge of the field, she knew, with a certainty that needed no words, that this was only the beginning of the map.